Our journey into the dark corners of the unexplained begins on the rain-swept streets of New Orleans, Louisiana, before climbing into the dense, suffocating wilderness of Glastonbury Mountain, Vermont. From there, we will travel back in time to the windswept shores of Roanoke Island, North Carolina, and dive beneath the treacherous, sunlit waters of Lake Lanier, Georgia. We will walk the paranoid neighborhoods of Circleville, Ohio, stand before the charred, occult ruins of Corpsewood Manor in Georgia, and navigate the mind-bending architectural trap of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. Finally, our path will take us through the toxic terror of Mattoon, Illinois, look into the ash-covered vengeance of Yazoo City, Mississippi, and conclude within a mathematically perfect ring of absolute biological death hidden deep in Chatham County, North Carolina. 10 locations, 10 mysteries, and a web of secrets that have baffled investigators for generations. And if you would like, leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. Pull up a chair, turn down the lights, and let us dive straight into our first case, where an entire American city was forced to play a deadly game of survival. Imagine walking down a pitch-black residential street in the late winter of 1919, where the only sound bouncing off the cobblestones is the deafening, frantic roar of thousands of brass instruments. On the night of March 19th, 1919, the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, did not sleep. Instead, every single home, saloon, and crowded dance hall was completely bathed in the wild, chaotic rhythms of live jazz music. This was not a celebration, and it was not a festival. It was a massive, collective act of desperation. Days prior, a highly disturbing letter had arrived at the offices of the local press, written by a regular reader who claimed to be a literal demon from the deepest pits of hell. The writer declared that at precisely 15 minutes past midnight on the night of March 19th, he would walk the streets of the city once again to select his next victims. But he offered a single, bizarre loophole for survival. He swore that he would completely spare any home, any building, and any establishment where a live jazz band was actively performing. That night, professional musicians and terrified amateurs alike played until their fingers bled, transforming an entire metropolis into a roaring, syncopated shield against an invisible monster. The ultimatum worked, and as the sun rose over the Mississippi River the next morning, the police logs confirmed that not a single drop of blood had been spilled. But the true horror of this case was not what happened on that noisy night in March. It was the terrifying reality that the authorities were completely powerless to stop the real flesh-and-blood predator hiding behind that supernatural persona. To understand the sheer panic that gripped New Orleans, we have to step back to the late spring of 1918, a time when the city was heavily segregated, deeply superstitious, and undergoing a massive demographic shift. The target of this atmospheric terror was a highly specific, industrious group of citizens, the Italian immigrant grocers who ran the neighborhood food markets. These family units were incredibly hardworking, operating multi-generational establishments where the ground floor served as the grocery store and the upper levels or back rooms served as the family living quarters. They were the absolute backbone of the local neighborhood economies, open from dawn until late in the evening. This meant they routinely handled cash, kept non-traditional hours, and lived in close proximity to their livelihoods. It was an environment built entirely on trust and community resilience. But it was also an environment that possessed an invisible vulnerability, a systemic weakness that a highly calculated, silent intruder began to study with absolute precision. The pattern of violence began to emerge in the dead of night, catching the New Orleans Police Department completely off guard. The perpetrator did not utilize conventional methods of forced entry. There were no shattered windows, no shattered locks, and no crowbars applied to heavy iron hinges. Instead, the discovery of the crime scenes revealed a terrifyingly methodical signature technique. The intruder would approach the rear of a grocery store under the cover of absolute darkness, utilizing a standard wood chisel to slowly, silently carve out the lower wooden panels of the back doors. They would create a perfect, unobstructed opening, just large enough to crawl through without making a single sound. Once inside, the predator would navigate the dark corridors, bypassing traditional valuables, and enter the bedrooms of the sleeping families. In a deeply unsettling display of psychological dominance, the attacker would almost never bring a personal weapon to the scene. Instead, they would locate the family's own tools, an axe left by the woodpile or a heavy cleaver from the butcher counter, and utilize those exact instruments to inflict catastrophic trauma on the victims while they were completely defenseless in their beds. The first major discovery occurred when a relative entered a corner grocery store to find a husband and wife suffering from devastating blunt force trauma, with the blood-stained axe left neatly resting at the foot of their bed. The active investigation fell under the immediate command of Chief of Police John D'Antonio, a detective who found himself navigating an absolute administrative nightmare. The early theories pursued by law enforcement leaned heavily into massive red herrings, driven by the intense social and racial biases of the era. The detectives immediately assumed that the attacks were the direct result of organized crime syndicates, specifically targeting extortion rings like the Black Hand, an early form of the Italian mafia that was known to target prosperous immigrant business owners. The local press leaned into this theory with aggressive intensity, publishing sensationalized headlines about secret society vendettas and blood oaths. The police conducted sweeping neighborhood raids, interrogating dozens of local laborers, looking for a centralized network of criminal masterminds. But the logic of the scenes continuously contradicted this theory. Traditional extortion rings leave a paper trail. They demand cash advances, they threaten property destruction, and they operate with a clear financial motive. The Axeman, however, left no demands, stole absolutely no currency from the registers, and left valuable diamond jewelry completely untouched on the nightstands. The investigation hit an absolute deadlock as the public hysteria reached a boiling point, culminating in the surreal, jazz-fueled night of March 19th, where the city successfully played for its life, after which the active assaults abruptly ceased altogether. For over half a century, the case of the New Orleans Axeman remained frozen in time, a historical curiosity dismissed as an unsolved anomaly of early 20th century American crime. But decades later, a specialized team of modern cold case forensic investigators, medical historians, and independent researchers decided to reopen the original archival police logs. They secured access to unredacted pathology profiles, original black and white crime scene photographs, and long-lost neighborhood real estate records. As they began mapping the geographic correlation between the targeted grocery shops, they noticed an overlooked detail that had completely escaped the original NOPD detectives. The targeted shops were not randomly distributed. They formed a tight protective perimeter around a burgeoning local entertainment industry, specifically a network of highly lucrative, competitive jazz clubs and music venues that were popping up throughout the city during the birth era of ragtime and early swing. This realization pushed the modern investigators into a stunning analytical breakthrough, leading them to re-examine a parallel series of records from 1919 and 1920 that had never been classified as homicides. They began tracking the deaths of prominent, highly talented local jazz musicians' prodigies who were rising rapidly through the ranks of the city's premier clubs. According to the original municipal health records, several of these musicians had suffered sudden, unexpected acute myocardial infarctions, essentially fatal heart attacks, dying abruptly in their dressing rooms or private residences without any prior history of cardiovascular illness. When the cold case team cross-referenced the police reports filed by the owners of the exact venues where these musicians performed on the nights of their deaths, the true, mind-bending reality of the case finally snapped into sharp focus. The physical evidence was absolute, hidden in plain sight within the archival property damage records. On the very nights these musical prodigies suffered their fatal medical emergencies, property owners had reported minor nighttime vandalism to the local precincts. Specifically, someone had utilized a wood chisel to carve out identical, precisely measured tool marks into the rear emergency exits and stage doors of the jazz clubs. The terrifying truth was that the Axeman was never a chaotic, random serial killer targeting immigrant grocers out of madness or mafia extortion. The grocer homicides were a massive, hyper-violent smokescreen, a calculated distraction designed to generate a state of absolute civic panic. The perpetrator was an elite, highly placed coordinator within the entertainment underworld who was systematically eliminating specific musical rivals to control the lucrative jazz circuits of New Orleans. The infamous letter demanding that the city play jazz on March 19th was a brilliant piece of psychological engineering. By forcing every house and club to blast music simultaneously, the killer created the ultimate auditory camouflage. The deafening citywide wall of sound completely masked the physical entry teams breaking into the back doors of the clubs to administer untraceable acute chemical toxins to the real targets, masking targeted assassinations as natural heart failure. The legal records for the New Orleans Axeman remain officially categorized as an unsolved historical mystery, with no individual ever facing formal prosecution in a court of law for the physical assaults. The entity that terrorized a city faded completely into the mist of Southern Gothic folklore, leaving behind an enduring legend of a demon who spared the musical. But for those who know the forensic reality beneath the myth, the true legacy of the case is a chilling reminder of how easily public terror can be manufactured to conceal a cold corporate conspiracy, leaving a dark, permanent stain on the golden age of American music. As the echoes of the New Orleans brass bands fade into the humid night, we leave the crowded southern streets behind and travel far to the north, climbing into the isolated rocky heights of New England, where a moving vehicle would become the setting for an even more impossible disappearance. As the dark, jazz-inflected mysteries of the Louisiana Bayou fade into the humid night, we leave the crowded southern streets behind and travel far to the north. Our destination shifts to the rugged, heavily forested ridges of New England, where a moving vehicle would become the setting for an even more impossible disappearance. We enter the freezing winter landscapes of Bennington County, Vermont, an isolated patch of land defined by the imposing shadows of the Green Mountain National Forest. This region is home to Glastonbury Mountain, a towering peak surrounded by dense wilderness that has been steeped in deep regional anxiety for centuries. Long before the mid-20th century, indigenous tribes completely avoided the upper peaks of this mountain, warning early European settlers that the ridges possessed a living, hostile entity that actively swallowed the wind and trapped unwary travelers in a permanent void. Between the years of 1945 and 1950, a highly disturbing 5-year window of absolute anomaly occurred within this specific geographic perimeter. 5 distinct individuals walked into these dense woods under completely normal circumstances and vanished entirely from the face of the earth, leaving behind no footprints, no discarded equipment, and no physical remains. But out of all the bizarre cold cases associated with what locals eventually dubbed the Bennington Triangle, none defied the fundamental laws of physical reality quite like the impossible evaporation of a man named James Tedford. To understand the sheer investigative frustration that this case generated, we have to look closely at the background and highly disciplined lifestyle of the subject. James Tedford was a 68-year-old retired veteran of the military, a man whose entire psychology had been permanently shaped by the rigid structures, strict schedules, and absolute predictability of service during the global conflicts of the early 20th century. He was a resident of a specialized soldiers' home located in Bennington, where staff members and fellow veterans knew him as a man of unyielding habit. He checked his mechanical pocket watch continuously, kept his living quarters in pristine inspection-ready order, and never deviated from his daily routines. In late November of 1949, Tedford decided to utilize a scheduled holiday weekend to travel north to visit family members in the small town of St. Albans. He packed a single, heavy canvas transit suitcase, dressed in his formal military surplus overcoat, and coordinated his travel plans down to the exact minute. On the evening of November 28, 1949, his relatives accompanied him to the local bus station, watching him board a large, commercial commuter transit coach bound for his return trip to Bennington. He was in excellent spirits, completely clear of any mental confusion, and visibly prepared for the routine several-hour journey back down south. The vehicle he boarded was a heavy, steel-framed intercity coach powered by a loud, front-mounted diesel engine. It was an environment of absolute physical enclosure. On this specific evening, the bus was operating at near maximum capacity, carrying 14 other passengers who were returning to their respective homes after the holiday. The interior environment of the coach was warm and dense, smelling strongly of damp wool overcoats, heavy diesel exhaust fumes, and stale tobacco smoke. Because the exterior temperatures across the Vermont mountain passes had dropped well below freezing, the large glass windows of the vehicle were heavily fogged and encrusted with condensation, completely obscuring any view of the pitch-black wilderness outside. James Tedford took a seat toward the middle rear section of the central aisle, settling in for the long night drive. Several of the passengers sitting directly adjacent to him noted his presence. He was a soft-spoken, exceptionally polite elderly man who carefully placed his canvas suitcase onto the overhead luggage rack, polished his reading glasses, and opened a printed paper travel timetable across his lap to track the scheduled route. As the heavy transit coach rumbled down Route 7, passing directly into the massive unlit shadow of Glastonbury Mountain and entering the notorious perimeter of the Bennington Triangle, the driver flipped a mechanical lever to dim the interior cabin lights. One by one, the tired passengers closed their eyes, lulled to sleep by the deep, rhythmic vibration of the diesel engine as the vehicle navigated the winding, continuous twists of the mountain highway. The transit coach maintained a completely continuous trajectory through the mountain passes, making absolutely no unscheduled stops, detours, or roadside pauses. The heavy double-folding entrance doors of the vehicle remained hermetically sealed by a manual pneumatic compression lever located exclusively under the physical control of the driver. At approximately the empty hours of the early morning, the bus finally air-braked to a halt inside the brightly lit, concrete terminal in downtown Bennington. The driver activated the overhead cabin lights, announcing the final destination. The sleepy passengers began stretching, reaching for their hats, and shuffling in a slow column down the narrow central aisle to exit into the station. The driver stood directly beside the open pneumatic doors, personally nodding and bidding goodnight to each individual as they stepped down onto the platform. Within minutes, the interior of the vehicle was entirely clear except for one single row toward the back. The driver, conducting a routine post-trip sweeping inspection for forgotten personal effects, walked down the aisle and stopped dead in his tracks. Occupying the middle rear row was an open, neatly folded printed bus schedule resting face up on the fabric seat cushion. On the floor directly beneath it sat a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. On the overhead metal rack directly above, James Tedford's heavy canvas suitcase remained untouched, its leather straps securely buckled, but the seat itself was entirely devoid of a human occupant. James Tedford had completely materialized out of existence while the vehicle was in continuous motion, surrounded by 14 awake or lightly sleeping witnesses. The Vermont State Police launched an immediate, highly intensive criminal investigation, sealing the transit coach as a primary forensic crime scene. Detectives and laboratory technicians methodically searched every square inch of the vehicle's interior, utilizing specialized lighting grids to check for signs of blood spatter, trace chemical residues, or indicators of a localized physical struggle. The interior environment was completely pristine, showing absolutely no signs of kinetic violence or mechanical disruption. Investigators systematically tracked down and conducted exhaustive interrogations with all 14 passengers who had occupied the coach during the night journey. The result was an absolute administrative deadlock. Every single witness provided a flawless, matching narrative sequence. They distinctly remembered the disciplined, older veteran boarding the bus in St. Albans. They recalled him sitting in that exact middle rear row, and several confirmed seeing his head resting against the fogged window pane as the vehicle entered the high-altitude mountain passes of Route 7. No one had heard a sound. No one had seen anyone stand up or walk down the narrow aisle. The driver swore under absolute oath that the heavy pneumatic doors had never been cycled open a single time between terminals, and a physical inspection of the emergency window latches confirmed that their factory-installed lead seals were entirely unbroken. Detectives pursued alternative hypotheses, investigating whether Tedford had suffered a sudden, severe cognitive fugue state or an acute psychological break, somehow slipping out of the vehicle unnoticed. But the continuous speed of the coach rendered that theory mechanically impossible. A 68-year-old man possessing a pronounced military limp could not have exited a fast-moving steel coach onto a dark highway without generating a massive, catastrophic kinetic event that would have instantly alerted everyone on board. The case hit an absolute, impenetrable brick wall, and the file was eventually transferred to the archival vaults as an unsolved disappearance that defied the basic properties of matter. For 3 decades, the vanishing of James Tedford remained a foundational urban legend of New England, frequently discussed by local folklore enthusiasts, but completely dismissed by serious criminologists as an unfortunate, unexplainable wilderness anomaly. But in the late autumn of 1979, the narrative underwent a massive, terrifying structural shift. A specialized team of regional forestry rangers and environmental survey technicians was dispatched to the highest, most restricted ridges of Glastonbury Mountain. Their specific assignment was to conduct a comprehensive structural integrity and safety assessment of an archaic fire lookout watchtower that had been completely boarded up, condemned, and abandoned by the state since the mid-20th century. The watchtower was a skeletal, rusted steel frame wrapped in decaying timber panels, entirely isolated from any modern infrastructure or public trails. As the Rangers utilized heavy crowbars to breach the rusted padlocks of the lower ground floor toolshed to clear out decades of organic rot, they discovered a heavy, reinforced industrial steel supply locker bolted directly into the solid granite bedrock of the mountain. Inside, buried beneath layers of dry rot, decayed surveying maps, and crystallized rodent droppings, they stumbled upon an item that made absolutely no historical sense: a heavy, military-grade portable reel-to-reel magnetic tape recorder. The machine was a specialized black crinkle finish unit manufactured in the late 1940s. Its internal vacuum tubes, heavy copper wiring, and brass gears remarkably preserved against the extreme alpine moisture by a heavy, pressurized vulcanized rubber gasket seal. The forestry rangers immediately transferred the heavy audio device to a state university forensic acoustics laboratory for specialized processing. Audio engineering specialists and forensic technicians utilized advanced chemical stabilizing solutions to prevent the brittle, decades-old magnetic tape from disintegrating before attempting to run it through a modernized playback deck. When they finally activated the mechanical reels, the initial forward audio signal was completely unintelligible, blasting through the laboratory monitors as a chaotic, deafening wall of low-frequency acoustic distortion. It sounded like an erratic mash of industrial white noise, heavy friction, and high-pitched mechanical screaming. The technicians initially assumed that the tape had simply suffered irreversible atmospheric degradation over its 30-year confinement on the peak. But a senior forensic audio analyst noted that the underlying low-frequency pulses exhibited a distinct, mathematically repeating mechanical cadence that did not align with natural degradation. Operating on a technical intuition, the analyst copied the raw analog frequency wave into a digital signal processor and executed an inversion protocol, completely reversing the tracking direction of the audio playback. When the reversed audio track began to play through the laboratory speakers, the entire team of technicians fell into absolute, paralyzed silence. The chaotic acoustic distortion completely resolved into a pristine, high-fidelity multi-track recording. The heavy rhythmic roar was instantly identified by engineers as the distinctive, unfiltered acoustic signature of a mid-century diesel transit coach engine operating at high revolutions per minute inside a hollow, resonating metal cabin. Layered directly over the roaring engine noise was the distinct audio track of a human being hyperventilating in a state of absolute existential terror. Through precise digital frequency mapping and vocal resonance comparison against historical radio interviews and military service files, experts confirmed that the voice belonged with absolute certainty to a younger James Tedford. But it was the specific linguistic structure of the vocal track that completely shattered the investigative paradigm. The voice was frantically, desperately screaming a single name over and over again into the void, James Tedford, but it was not a standard vocalization. The forensic phonetic analysis revealed that the speaker was uttering the syllables of his own name using a completely inverted linguistic syntax and reversed grammatical structure, as if his vocal cords were producing a physical reflection bounced off a non-Euclidean spatial mirror. The harrowing 10-minute loop captured the exact sequence of an impossible event. The sounds of the diesel engine suddenly experienced a massive artificial pitch shift, the acoustic geometry of the background environment began to violently warp, and the inverted vocalizations were abruptly pulled backward into a vacuum of absolute silence as the recording terminated. The discovery completely upended the historical understanding of the Bennington Triangle. James Tedford did not voluntarily flee his life, and he was not intercepted by a human predator. His physical body had intersected with a highly localized, unclassified atmospheric and spatial anomaly unique to the high-density granite and quartz deposits of Glastonbury Mountain. The military-grade tape recorder found inside the locked tower was not the product of a modern hoax. It was an automated seismic and acoustic monitoring station deployed by a classified black-budget military research division in the winter of 1949 that had successfully intercepted and recorded the displaced acoustic frequency of the vanishing passenger as his physical consciousness was refracted across the boundaries of time and space. The legal file remains an open, unclassified intersection of military secrecy and cosmic terror that continues to cast a long, chilling shadow over the deep woods of Vermont. From the impossible evaporation of a single passenger inside a sealed, moving vehicle, our journey now takes a dramatic leap backward through time, traveling to the very foundational mysteries of the American continent. We descend from the frozen mountain peaks to the windswept, low-lying shores of the Atlantic coast, where an entire historical settlement of over 100 souls vanished behind locked wooden fortifications, leaving behind a written message that was completely misunderstood by the modern world. While the impossible acoustic distortion of the Vermont mountain passes suggests that space and time can twist around a lonely highway, the phenomenon of the sudden, clean evaporation of human life runs far deeper into the foundational soil of the American continent. To discover the absolute origins of these geographic voids, we have to travel much further back into the past, leaving the mid-20th century behind and descending toward the low-lying, fog-enshrouded coastlines of the late 16th century. Long before modern forensic science, automated surveillance, or digital networks existed to track the movements of human populations, a group of pioneers stepped off an ocean transit vessel onto the isolated shores of the New World, completely unaware that they were walking directly into an architectural and environmental trap. The baseline narrative of this location has been taught to schoolchildren across the United States for generations as a simple, tragic mystery of early colonial migration. But when independent historical researchers and archaeological recovery teams began unearthing the deep, subsurface layers of physical evidence left behind at the site, the traditional explanation of cultural assimilation completely collapsed, revealing a terrifying forensic anomaly that suggests the true threat did not emerge from the unknown American wilderness, but was carried across the Atlantic within the dark, sealed confines of their own cargo holds. The foundational framework of the settlement was established in the late summer of 1587. Governor John White, a highly disciplined navigator and meticulous artist, led a vulnerable contingent of 115 English pioneers, consisting of men, women, and children, to establish a permanent agricultural and strategic colony on Roanoke Island, located off the coast of what is now modern-day North Carolina. The environment was exceptionally beautiful, but brutally unforgiving, defined by volatile maritime weather patterns, dense maritime forests, and absolute isolation from any immediate military or logistical support lines. Almost immediately upon arrival, the pioneers faced severe systemic challenges. Their initial crop yields failed to adapt to the sandy coastal soil, their specialized tools suffered rapid structural degradation from the constant salt exposure, and relations with local indigenous tribes quickly deteriorated into a state of silent, mutual suspicion. Realizing that the community would not survive the approaching winter without an immediate injection of industrial tools, preserved rations, and livestock, the colonial council forced White to make an agonizing decision. He would board the remaining transit vessel and sail back across the Atlantic to secure emergency provisions from the English crown, promising the 115 souls of the colony that he would return before the change of the seasons. But the geopolitical chessboard of the late 16th century completely shattered White's timeline. Almost immediately upon his arrival in Europe, the historic conflict between England and the Spanish Empire erupted into open warfare, culminating in the deployment of the Spanish Armada. Queen Elizabeth I issued an absolute, mandatory embargo on all domestic shipping, impounding every seaworthy merchant vessel for the immediate defense of the home territory. For 3 agonizing years, White was physically prevented from returning to his family and his colony, forced to watch the horizon while knowing that the people he left behind on Roanoke Island were completely isolated on the edge of a vast, uncharted continent. It was not until August of 1590, a full 36 months after his departure, that White was finally permitted to secure passage on a privateering vessel bound for the Outer Banks of the New World. As the ship finally anchored off the coast of Roanoke Island in the heavy, humid mist of a late summer evening, the crew fired their heavy signal cannons into the twilight sky, hoping to receive a responsive column of smoke or a traditional horn blast from the shore. The only response from the island was the low, hollow moaning of the Atlantic wind moving through the coastal pines. The next morning, White and a heavily armed recovery team rowed their landing craft through the breaking surf, stepping onto the damp sand of the beach in a state of heightened anxiety. The scene that awaited them within the primary settlement perimeter was completely unprecedented in the history of maritime exploration. The heavy wooden defensive palisade, a reinforced wall of sharpened tree trunks designed to withstand a prolonged physical siege, stood entirely intact, showing absolutely no signs of kinetic violence, ballistic trauma, or structural breach. But as White stepped through the main entrance of the fortification, he was met by a suffocating, unnatural silence. The settlement was completely devoid of human life. The 115 pioneers had entirely evaporated. White methodically walked through the abandoned dwellings, discovering that the scene did not resemble a rushed, chaotic evacuation. Inside the primary storehouses and domestic quarters, personal effects were neatly arranged. Heavy iron cooking cauldrons rested undisturbed over cold hearths, and the community's heavy defensive artillery pieces remained securely mounted on their wooden platforms, fully loaded and oriented toward the tree line. There was no blood spatter on the floors, no skeletal remains buried in the common areas, and no signs of structural fire. The only physical clue left behind was a solitary, cryptic message. The letters CROATOAN were deeply, precisely carved into the dense grain of a central defensive pillar. The immediate investigation conducted by Governor White was defined by a frantic search for logical alignment, but every hypothesis he pursued ran directly into absolute logical contradictions. The primary theory adopted by the ship's captain, and later summarized in standard historical archives, was that the colony had simply succumbed to starvation and voluntarily relocated to the neighboring island of Croatoan, integrating with the friendly local population to ensure their biological survival. White desperately wanted to accept this explanation, but his analytical background forced him to note severe investigative anomalies at the scene. Before his departure in 1587, White had established a strict, mandatory communications protocol with the colonial leadership. If the pioneers were forced to abandon the fortification under duress, they were strictly ordered to carve a cross directly above their destination marker to signify an active emergency or an immediate threat. The carving on the wooden post contained no cross, suggesting an orderly, unhurried departure. But if the evacuation was planned and voluntary, why had they abandoned their most valuable, irreplaceable survival assets? The pioneers had left behind their heavy iron tools, their remaining stores of gunpowder, and their personal domestic items, provisions that no rational group of settlers would leave behind if they were migrating to a new territory. The red herring of tribal integration completely fell apart under forensic scrutiny. Human beings do not leave their heavy, survival essential assets fully intact and walk naked into the wilderness unless they are pulled away by a force that invalidates their rational survival instincts. The investigation hit a critical deadlock as an immense maritime storm began organizing off the coast, threatening to tear the privateering ships away from their shallow anchorages. With time rapidly running out, White realized he needed to locate the colony's primary institutional records to understand the final days of the settlement. He remembered a highly confidential countermeasure that he and the colonial secretaries had executed before his departure. To protect the colony's most sensitive legal charters, proprietary maritime maps, and historical books from both the extreme weather conditions and potential external discovery by Spanish scouting parties, they had constructed a series of deep subsurface cache sites. These were reinforced underground storage pits excavated directly beneath the heavy oak floorboards of the governor's primary residence, lined with thick layers of dry pine straw and sealed inside heavy, lead-lined wooden transit chests. White directed his remaining crew to bring shovels and crowbars into the ruined structure, clearing away the encroaching sand and organic debris to begin a targeted excavation of the earth. The physical recovery of the hidden caches shifted the entire trajectory of the Roanoke narrative from a traditional historical migration mystery into an absolute nightmare of inexplicable violence. After clearing several feet of dense, impacted coastal soil, the crew's shovels struck the heavy timber framing of the subterranean vault. Working with ropes, they slowly hoisted the massive oak transit trunks up into the dim afternoon light. White stepped forward to inspect the containers, noting that the heavy iron padlocks and reinforced corner brackets were completely undisturbed. The external metal showed significant rust and atmospheric oxidation from 3 years in the damp earth, but the structural integrity of the locks was flawless. There were absolutely no tool marks, prying damage, or indicators of external manipulation. But when the sailors utilized heavy iron crowbars to violently shatter the rusted locks and throw open the lids, expecting to find water-damaged paper or dry rot, they witnessed a forensic anomaly that completely defied the basic properties of physical containment. The highly sensitive legal documents, hand-drawn maps, and bound leather books inside the chests had been completely lacerated, shredded, and transformed into a fine, fibrous mass of organic pulp. But the destruction had not been caused by moisture, insects, or environmental decay. As White carefully removed the shredded remains of his personal archives, the flashlights illuminated the interior infrastructure of the heavy oak trunks. The thick wood panels of the containers were covered in hundreds of deep, parallel scoring marks and violent gouges. These deep lacerations were fresh, sharp, and cut with immense physical force, and every single mark was executed exclusively from the inside out. The heavy iron trim along the interior edges of the lids was visibly warped and bowed upward, showing distinct, tool-like abrasions where a concentrated physical force had desperately hammered against the sealed containment mechanism from the inside of the locked subterranean chests. The true sequence of events on Roanoke Island finally reconstructed itself from a terrifying, non-linear angle. The threat that had systematically eliminated the 115 souls of the lost colony had never emerged from the dark, unknown American wilderness, and it had never been a human adversary. The pioneers had unknowingly brought the predator with them across the Atlantic, hidden deep within the dark, vacuum-sealed storage holds of their original transit ships. An ancient, unclassified biological or spatial entity had lain completely dormant within the dark preservation of the old European state archives and legal books. When White buried the chest deep beneath the earth in 1587, the unique combination of the high salinity subterranean soil, the absolute lack of light, and the pressurized atmospheric containment had acted as a massive incubator. The entity had horthawed, mutated, and gestated within the sealed legal trunks, gradually consuming the documents until it achieved physical mass and violently forced its way out of the locked boxes from the inside, tunneling up through the floorboards of the residence while the colony slept. It did not attack the settlement with kinetic violence. It absorbed the population silently, neutralizing their cognitive survival instincts and causing 115 highly disciplined pioneers to abandon their weapons, their tools, and their homes to walk in a silent, synchronized column directly into the low-lying coastal fog, leaving behind a solitary written marker that was never a message to John White, but a phonetic attempt by the final survivor to record the acoustic frequency of the entity as it swallowed the town. Governor White was forced to abandon any further excavation as the maritime storm reached hurricane velocity, snapping the anchor lines of the privateering vessels and forcing the crew to retreat back to open water. White sailed back to Europe, broken in spirit and physically ruined, spending the remainder of his life attempting to scrub the memory of the shredded archives from his consciousness. The legal files of Roanoke were permanently closed by the English crown, buried beneath centuries of standardized colonial history to prevent future generations from looking too closely at the true cost of stepping onto the shores of the New World. Roanoke remains an active historical landmark, masking a profound cosmic void beneath the surface of the coastal sands. As the cold Atlantic currents pull the memory of the lost colony down into the dark wilderness of the past, we leave the 16th century shoreline behind and travel forward across centuries, moving deep into the interior of the American South, where another artificial body of water would be engineered to submerge the secrets of a modern anomaly. Beneath the sparkling, sunlit surface of one of the most heavily trafficked summer recreation destinations in North America lies a dark, submerged secret that modern engineering has spent decades attempting to suppress. Every year, millions of vacationers, boaters, and families flock to the picturesque shores of Lake Lanier in Georgia, drawn by its multi-million-dollar marinas, luxury resorts, and seemingly tranquil blue waters. But as the winter wind sweeps across the reservoir, dropping the surface temperature and clearing the seasonal algae blooms, a terrifyingly clear view of the lake bed emerges. Submerged beneath millions of gallons of artificial water sits a completely intact, frozen ghost town. Visitors floating on the surface are completely unaware that directly beneath their fiberglass hulls are the silent, standing skeletons of old wooden churches, forgotten family homesteads, and hundreds of historic grave sites that were never relocated. This massive body of water has earned a notorious, deeply unsettling reputation within the United States market as an active geographic anomaly responsible for an inexplicably high volume of annual drownings and watercraft malfunctions that consistently defy conventional logic. But the true horror of this location is not the historical remnants rotting in the dark. It is the mind-bending reality uncovered by specialized deep water recovery teams whose advanced scanning equipment registered an impossible, the highly coordinated movement occurring within the freezing depths of the abyss, a phenomenon that suggests the dark history of the valley refused to remain buried beneath the waves. To understand the profound structural and psychological tension that defines this modern body of water, the narrative must step back in time to the early autumn of 1912, within the borders of Forsyth County, Georgia. Long before the valley was consumed by an artificial sea, it was home to a thriving, deeply prosperous, and self-sustaining black community known as Oscarville. This neighborhood was a vibrant epicenter of agricultural success, featuring multi-generational family farms, local businesses, and highly successful community institutions. The citizens of Oscarville had spent decades cultivating the fertile soil of the valley, establishing a highly resilient microeconomy built entirely on mutual trust and shared prosperity. But, in the late months of 1912, a wave of intense racial violence, coordinated night rider attacks, and systematic structural intimidation swept through the county. The entire population of Oscarville was violently thrashed, depopulated, and forced to flee their ancestral lands under the cover of darkness, leaving behind their crops, their livestock, and their homes. The territory sat completely abandoned for decades, slowly reclaimed by the dense Georgia pine forests, transforming into a silent, overgrown monument to a massive historical trauma. Fast forward to the early months of 1956, the United States federal government, seeking to construct a massive hydroelectric dam to supply power and water to the rapidly expanding metropolis of Atlanta, initiated an ambitious infrastructure project. The engineers selected the abandoned valley of Oscarville as the primary basin for a massive artificial reservoir. Instead of executing a meticulous, respectful clearance of the valley, the state chose to expedite the construction timeline. They authorized the immediate detonation of the valley floors and unleashed the floodgates, intentionally submerging the entire structural layout of Oscarville, along with its historic community cemeteries, beneath a massive aquatic shroud. As the decades progressed, the newly created Lake Lanier transformed into a premier public playground. But alongside the booming tourism economy, a grim statistical pattern began to grip the local emergency services. Every single summer season, a pattern of entirely inexplicable disappearances and fatal aquatic incidents plagued the reservoir. Highly experienced swimmers who were in peak physical condition, commercial divers, and alert boaters would suddenly slip beneath the surface without letting out a single cry for help or demonstrating any visible signs of distress. Surviving witnesses who managed to escape the water began filing highly consistent, chilling operational reports with the local precincts. They described experiencing a sudden, overwhelming downward force in entirely calm, currentless waters, a sensation of cold, invisible entities anchoring their limbs and pulling them into the absolute darkness of the lakebed. When search and rescue dive teams were deployed to recover the missing individuals, they noted that the bodies were routinely discovered at the absolute bottom of the reservoir, showing classic signs of rapid water infiltration and asphyxiation, but with highly anomalous physiological markings. The subsequent autopsy results frequently noted distinct, deep localized bruising around the ankles and lower calves of the victims. These precise contusion patterns suggested that the individuals had been physically grasped and anchored underwater by an immense kinetic pressure rather than simply losing their ability to maintain buoyancy. The local sheriff's department, state park rangers, and marine safety hydrologists launched a series of comprehensive technical investigations to address the escalating public panic and counter the viral lore spreading across modern social media networks. The authorities continuously leaned into entirely conventional material explanations, focusing heavily on massive red herrings designed to shield the local tourism industry from financial collapse. They argued that the elevated casualty rate was simply the predictable mathematical result of millions of inexperienced recreationists crowding into an artificial body of water. The official reports blamed the high death toll on hidden underwater hazards, specifically the thousands of fully intact oak and pine tree stands that had been left completely upright when the valley was flooded in 1956. They suggested that swimmers were simply getting their clothing or equipment snagged in the submerged timber, tangled in abandoned fishing monofilament, or trapped inside the collapsing structural framework of the old flooded homes. They claimed that the sharp thermal layers of the lake, known as thermoclines, created natural, disorienting undercurrents that could easily induce panic and sudden cramping in a swimmer. but commercial salvage and recovery divers continuously challenged these official explanations. They noted in their private logs that a significant percentage of the highest-profile disappearances occurred in the wide-open, deep central channels of the reservoir zones that were entirely clear of underwater timber stands, where the lakebed consisted of flat, featureless silt, and where the water column was entirely stagnant, possessing a physical current of absolute zero. The case reached a critical turning point following a highly publicized triple disappearance during a holiday weekend, where 3 individuals vanished simultaneously from a stationary pontoon boat in the middle of a clear afternoon without creating a single splash or disturbance on the surface. Facing intense political scrutiny and public demonstrations, the state authorized the deployment of a highly specialized, black-budget deep-water salvage and forensic research team. This elite unit did not rely on traditional human search divers, who were structurally limited by the extreme depth and low visibility of the lake. Instead, the engineers utilized advanced marine exploration technologies, including state-of-the-art side-scan sonar arrays and high-definition underwater thermal imaging systems capable of mapping the absolute floor of the reservoir at depths exceeding 40 meters. The team's primary objective was to isolate any unknown geological shifts, methane venting pockets, or structural failures within the submerged valley floor that could account for the terrifying downward forces reported by survivors. As the research vessel moved systematically across the deep central channel of the lake, dragging the advanced side-scan sonar array behind it, the technicians monitoring the real-time digital feeds witnessed a sequence of events that completely shattered the conventional framework of marine physics. At 40 meters below the surface, the environment of Lake Lanier is defined by an absolute, suffocating darkness, immense atmospheric pressure, and an icy temperature that permanently sits near the freezing mark. Because there is a total lack of light and oxygen in this deep trench, biological life is virtually non-existent, rendering the zone an entirely sterile, motionless abyss. The side-scan sonar first mapped the physical typography of the lakebed, tracing the flawless, pristine grid lines of the old main roads of Oscarville, preserved perfectly beneath the heavy silt layers. But as the vessel aligned itself directly with the historical coordinates of the Old Town Square, the military-grade thermal imaging monitors began registering a massive, impossible anomaly. The screens suddenly illuminated with dozens of highly concentrated, human-shaped thermal mass signatures. These profiles did not possess the erratic movement of floating debris, and they did not match the thermal patterns of any known aquatic species. The video feed captured a chilling, highly disciplined choreography. These human-shaped thermal silhouettes were moving with absolute, uniform intent, marching in perfect, organized rows and synchronized columns directly along the flooded main streets of the underwater ghost town. The advanced thermal sensors, which had been thoroughly calibrated to detect the standard baseline temperature of the icy, stagnant water, confirmed that these signatures were generating an independent, active kinetic heat signature, a physical impossibility within a currentless, freezing abyss unless an active, intelligent energy process was occurring. The investigators realized with absolute horror that the deadly forces pulling swimmers down into the depths were never random branches, abandoned fishing lines, or imaginary currents. The hundreds of unmoved historical gravesites and the collective trauma of the 1912 forced expulsions had generated a localized, hyperdense kinetic and spatial field beneath the water column. The displaced population of Oscarville was actively, systematically reoccupying their stolen geography, moving as a synchronized spectral force along the submerged grid lines of their old community. Whenever an unsuspecting modern recreationist swam directly above these active thermal columns, the sheer kinetic drag generated by the mass movement of the invisible marchers created a violent, highly localized downward vacuum, physically grabbing the individuals by the ankles and pulling them down into the freezing darkness to submerge them within the forgotten population. The legal and scientific files detailing the underwater thermal scanning operations at Lake Lanier were immediately seized, classified, and buried within the highest administrative vaults of the state government, completely omitted from public safety briefings to prevent a total collapse of the regional economy. The reservoir remains open to the public today, drawing millions of oblivious visitors to its shores every summer. It stands as a beautiful, sunlit shroud, masking a dark, restless, and deeply vengeful modern monument to an unavenged historical crime beneath its waves, a chilling reminder that some secrets refuse to remain buried by the passage of time or the weight of millions of gallons of water. As the dark, flooded grid lines of the Georgia Reservoir fade into the deep silence of the underwater valley, we leave the haunted currents of the South behind. Our journey takes us back north, moving out of the wilderness and entering the paranoid, grid-mapped neighborhoods of a quiet Midwestern town, where an invisible, omniscient predator would turn the simple act of opening the morning mail into a terrifying game of psychological survival. The tranquil, sunlit surface of a massive public reservoir can mask a dark, structural void that modern engineering has spent decades trying to hide from the public eye. Every single summer season, millions of vacationers, recreational boaters, and families travel to the picturesque shores of Lake Lanier in Georgia. They are drawn by the promise of multi-million-dollar luxury marinas, pristine shoreline resorts, and waters that appear completely calm and inviting. But as the winter winds move across the valley, dropping the surface temperature and clearing out the seasonal algae blooms, an entirely different, deeply unsettling reality emerges from the depths. Submerged beneath millions of gallons of artificial water sits a fully intact, frozen ghost town. Visitors floating on the surface in fiberglass hulls are completely unaware that directly beneath them are the silent, standing skeletons of wooden churches, old family homesteads, and hundreds of historic grave sites that were never relocated before the valley was flooded. Within the United States true crime and paranormal communities, this specific location has earned a notorious reputation as an active geographic anomaly responsible for an inexplicably high volume of annual casualties and sudden watercraft malfunctions that consistently baffle local search and rescue teams. But the true horror of this location does not lie within the rotting structures resting in the mud. It was uncovered by a specialized deep-water salvage operation whose advanced scanning arrays registered an impossible, highly coordinated movement occurring within the freezing depths of the abyss, a phenomenon that suggests the dark history of the submerged valley refused to remain buried by the passage of time. To understand the profound structural and psychological tension that defines this modern recreation destination, the narrative must step back in time to the early autumn of 1912, within the rural borders of Forsyth County, Georgia. Long before the valley was consumed by a man-made sea, it was home to a thriving, highly prosperous, and entirely self-sustaining community known as Oscarville. This neighborhood was a vibrant epicenter of agricultural success and generational wealth established exclusively by industrious black citizens. The community featured meticulously managed family farms, successful local businesses, blacksmith shops, and highly attended civic and religious institutions. The residents of Oscarville had spent decades cultivating the fertile soil of the valley, constructing a highly resilient microeconomy built entirely on mutual trust, shared labor, and deep community roots. But in the late months of 1912, a wave of intense hostility, coordinated night rider attacks, and systematic structural intimidation began to sweep through the surrounding county. Within a matter of weeks, the entire population of Oscarville was subjected to a campaign of absolute terror. Families were violently displaced, thrashed, and forced to flee their ancestral properties under the cover of a pitch-black night, abandoning their standing crops, their livestock, and the homes they had spent lifetimes constructing. The territory sat completely abandoned for decades, slowly reclaimed by the dense, encroaching Georgia pine forests, transforming into a silent, overgrown monument to a massive historical injustice. The timeline shifts to the early months of 1956, when federal infrastructure engineers, seeking to construct a massive hydroelectric dam to supply power and water to the rapidly expanding metropolis of Atlanta, finalized their plans for a massive artificial reservoir. The survey team selected the abandoned, low-lying valley of Oscarville as the primary basin for the project. Rather than executing a meticulous, respectful clearance of the land, the state authorities chose to prioritize an aggressive, highly expedited construction schedule to minimize budgetary expenditures. They authorized the immediate detonation of the valley floor and unleashed the local riverways, completely submerging the standing structural framework of Oscarville beneath millions of gallons of water, creating what the public now knows as Lake Lanier. The historical gravesites and family cemeteries were left entirely intact beneath the rising tides, covered by a massive aquatic shroud. As the decades progressed and the lake transformed into a highly lucrative public playground, a grim, undeniable statistical pattern began to trouble the local emergency management services. Every single summer season, an alarming number of peak physical condition swimmers, professional divers, and alert boaters would completely vanish beneath the surface. These incidents almost never featured a classic struggle. Victims would slip under the completely calm, currentless water without letting out a single cry for help or demonstrating any visible signs of distress. When specialized recovery teams eventually located the missing individuals at the absolute floor of the reservoir, forensic pathologists noted a highly unusual, repeating anomaly. The subsequent autopsy results frequently revealed distinct, deep, localized bruising and severe contusions wrapped symmetrically around the ankles and lower calves of the victims, suggesting their bodies had been physically grasped and anchored downward by an immense kinetic force before aquatic asphyxiation occurred. The local sheriff's department, state park rangers, and marine safety hydrologists launched a series of comprehensive technical investigations to address the escalating public anxiety and counter the viral lore spreading across modern digital networks. The official agencies continuously leaned into entirely conventional material explanations, focusing heavily on massive red herrings designed to shield the regional tourism economy from financial collapse. They argued that the high casualty rate was simply the predictable mathematical byproduct of millions of inexperienced tourists crowding into an artificial body of water. The official investigative reports blamed the high death toll on hidden structural hazards, specifically the thousands of fully intact oak and pine tree stands that had been left completely upright during the hurried 1956 flooding. They suggested that swimmers were simply getting their limbs or equipment caught in the submerged timber branches, tangled in rogue fishing monofilament, or trapped inside the collapsing architecture of the old flooded homes. They claimed that the sharp thermal layers of the lake, known as thermoclines, created natural, disorienting downward currents that could easily induce sudden cramping and muscle failure in an unsuspecting swimmer. But commercial salvage teams and independent rescue divers continuously challenged these official findings. They noted in their private operational logs that a significant percentage of the highest profile disappearances occurred within the wide-open, deep central channels of the reservoir trenches that were entirely clear of underwater timber stands, where the lake bed consisted of flat, featureless silt, and where the water column was entirely stagnant, possessing a physical current of absolute zero. The case reached a critical turning point following a highly publicized triple disappearance during a major holiday weekend. 3 individuals completely vanished from a stationary floating pontoon boat in the middle of a clear, windless afternoon without creating a single splash, wave, or ripple on the surface of the water. Facing intense political scrutiny, legal challenges from the families, and widespread public demonstrations, the state government authorized the temporary deployment of a highly specialized black-budget marine salvage and forensic research team. This elite unit did not rely on traditional human search divers, who were structurally limited by the absolute darkness and low visibility of the lake's lower levels. Instead, the engineers utilized advanced marine exploration technologies, dragging a state-of-the-art side-scan sonar array and a military-grade high-definition underwater thermal imaging system directly through the deepest trenches of the reservoir at depths exceeding 40 meters. Their primary objective was to isolate any unknown geological shifts, submerged methane venting pockets, or structural failures within the flooded valley floor that could account for the terrifying downward vacuum forces reported by the rare survivors of the lake. As the research vessel cut through the silent central channel of the lake, the technicians monitoring the real-time digital telemetry feeds witnessed a sequence of events that completely shattered the conventional boundaries of marine physics. At 40 meters below the surface, the interior environment of Lake Lanier is defined by a suffocating, absolute darkness, immense atmospheric pressure, and an icy temperature that permanently sits near the freezing mark. Because there is a total lack of light and dissolved oxygen in this deep trench, biological life is virtually non-existent, rendering the zone an entirely sterile, motionless abyss. The side-scan sonar first mapped the physical typography of the lakebed, tracing the flawless, pristine layout of the old main roads and property perimeters of Oscarville, preserved perfectly beneath layers of heavy silt. But as the vessel aligned its sensors directly with the historical coordinates of the Old Town Square, the military-grade thermal imaging monitors began registering a massive, impossible anomaly. The screens suddenly illuminated with dozens of highly concentrated, human-shaped thermal mass signatures. These profiles did not possess the erratic movement of floating debris, and they did not match the thermal patterns of any known aquatic species. The digital video feed captured a chilling, highly disciplined choreography. These human-shaped thermal silhouettes were moving with absolute uniform intent, marching in perfect, organized rows and synchronized columns directly along the flooded pathways of the underwater ghost town. The advanced thermal sensors, which had been thoroughly calibrated to detect the standard baseline temperature of the icy, stagnant water, confirmed that these signatures were generating an independent, active kinetic heat signature, a physical impossibility within a currentless, freezing abyss unless an active energy process was occurring. The true sequence of events on the floor of the reservoir finally reconstructed itself from a terrifying, non-linear angle. The deadly forces pulling swimmers down into the depths were never random branches, abandoned fishing lines, or imaginary currents. The hundreds of unmoved historical grave sites and the collective trauma of the 1912 forced expulsions had generated a permanent kinetic and spatial displacement field beneath the water column. The displaced population of Oscarville was actively, systematically reoccupying their stolen geography, moving as a synchronized, spectral force along the submerged grid lines of their old community. Whenever an unsuspecting modern recreationist swam directly above these active thermal columns, the sheer kinetic friction and spatial displacement generated by the mass movement of the invisible marchers created a sudden, violent downward vacuum, physically grasping the individuals by the ankles and pulling them down into the freezing darkness to submerge them within the forgotten population. The state government immediately seized and classified the thermal imaging data, locking it away within the highest administrative vaults to protect the regional economy. Lake Lanier remains open today, a sunlit playground masking an active aquatic monument to an unavenged historical crime, a chilling reminder that some secrets refuse to remain buried by the passage of time or the weight of millions of gallons of water. As the dark, flooded grid lines of the Georgia Reservoir fade into the deep silence of the underwater valley, we leave the haunted currents of the South behind. Our journey takes us back north, moving out of the wilderness and entering the paranoid grid-map neighborhoods of a quiet Midwestern town where an invisible, omniscient predator would turn the simple act of opening the morning mail into a terrifying game of psychological survival. The transition from the deep, hidden thermal signatures of a flooded southern valley to the sun-bleached asphalt of a quiet Midwestern suburb brings us to a form of terror that does not hide beneath the waves. Instead, this psychological weapon arrived in broad daylight, slipping entirely unnoticed into the most trusted and mundane fixture of American civic life, the neighborhood mailbox. In the late summer of 1976, the residents of Circleville, Ohio, began experiencing a slow, creeping collapse of their domestic privacy. This was not a localized criminal assault defined by physical break-ins or structural theft. It was an omniscient, completely invisible campaign of mass surveillance conducted through the United States postal system. For nearly 2 decades, thousands of highly aggressive letters, rendered exclusively in distinct block-printed capital letters, flooded the small town. The anonymous writer possessed an impossible, godlike awareness of the community's deeply buried personal secrets, systemic indiscretions, and hidden financial vulnerabilities. No family was entirely safe, and no bedroom conversation remained private. The community quickly descended into a state of absolute, localized paranoia, where neighbors looked at neighbors with deep suspicion, and the simple act of opening the morning mail became a terrifying exercise in psychological survival. But the true, mind-bending reality of the Circleville stalker was not the venom contained within the pages. It was the terrifying discovery made by forensic investigators long after they believed the perpetrator had been safely locked away behind prison walls, a revelation that proved the absolute surveillance of the town was being managed by an entity that defied conventional identification. To understand the profound structural claustrophobia that systematically dismantled the community of Circleville, we have to look closely at the background and layout of the town in 1976. Circleville was a classic, tight-knit agricultural and manufacturing hub, a place where multi-generational families lived in close proximity, and where the local social structure was heavily built upon reputation, church attendance, and public conformity. Within this environment, a woman named Mary Gillespie operated as a highly dedicated, entirely routine school bus driver. Mary was widely respected throughout the school district, known for her strict adherence to safety protocols, her warm relationship with the local children, and her quiet, conventional family life with her husband, Ron Gillespie. The family unit lived a modest, predictable existence, heavily integrated into the neighborhood networks. Mail delivery in Circleville was viewed as a highly trusted, completely safe routine, a daily connection to the outside world that brought utility bills, family updates, and local advertisements. It was a fixture of absolute security. But this trusted network was weaponized with absolute precision when Mary received the first anonymous envelope, an event that planted the subtle, highly destructive seeds of a massive domestic trauma. The initial letters arrived without a return address, postmarked from the nearby metropolitan center of Columbus, Ohio. Inside, the pages contained highly explicit, deeply aggressive allegations accusing Mary of engaging in an illicit, non-traditional romantic affair with the superintendent of the local school district. Mary immediately denied the charges, treating the document as the isolated act of a malicious prankster. But within weeks, the frequency of the mailings escalated into a massive torrent. The letters were not just sent to Mary, they were systematically routed to her husband Ron, her extended relatives, her neighbors, and the administrators of the school board. The block-printed script displayed a terrifying, absolute surveillance of Mary's daily life. The writer documented the exact minute she left her driveway, the specific grocery aisles she navigated, and the precise clothing she wore on any given Tuesday. The psychological pressure reached a critical inflection point when Ron Gillespie received a highly targeted letter explicitly stating that if he did not take immediate, violent measures to terminate his wife's alleged behavior, his life would be brought to a swift, highly engineered conclusion. The pattern of digital-like surveillance without modern technology transformed the quiet streets of Circleville into a living panopticon. The situation escalated from psychological warfare to direct kinetic violence on a hot afternoon during Mary's routine bus transit route. As she navigated her empty school bus down a rural country lane, she noted an unusual fixture mounted directly to a wooden fence post along the shoulder of the road. It was a crudely constructed, hand-painted wooden box. Sensing an immediate threat to the children who walked that specific route, Mary parked the vehicle, stepped out into the humid air, and approached the structure. Upon opening the front panel, she discovered a highly sophisticated, lethal booby trap. Inside the box sat a loaded .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun, securely anchored to an internal wooden frame. A complex trigger mechanism had been engineered using a high-tension steel spring attached to a long cord that extended through the rear of the box, designed to function as a tripwire that would instantly discharge the weapon directly into Mary's chest the moment she attempted to clear the box from the post. By pure chance, Mary had approached the structure from an angle that prevented the wire from toggling the firing pin. The Pickaway County Sheriff's Department immediately assumed absolute command of the primary crime scene, treating the booby trap as an attempted homicide. Detective units and forensic technicians methodically processed the wooden box and the firearm, looking for latent fingerprints or trace dynamic evidence. While the exterior of the weapon had been meticulously wiped clean of organic oils, the technicians successfully utilized a specialized chemical etching protocol to restore a partially filed-off factory serial number on the internal housing of the firing mechanism. The restored serial number broke the case wide open, tracing the ownership of the .25 caliber pistol directly to a man named Paul Freshour. Paul was not a stranger to the family. He was Mary Gillespie's brother-in-law, a highly articulate, bitter individual who was currently undergoing a contentious, highly volatile divorce from Ron Gillespie's sister. The prosecution's theory solidified instantly. Freshour was a disgruntled, hyper-obsessed lone wolf who had manufactured the entire anonymous letter campaign to systematically destroy the social and financial stability of the Gillespie family as an act of proxy revenge. During the subsequent criminal trial, handwriting analysts presented extensive testimony comparing Freshour's known writing samples to the block capitals of the Circleville letters, claiming a structural match. Despite Freshour maintaining absolute innocence and providing an alibi for the afternoon the booby trap was mounted, the jury found him guilty of attempted murder. He was sentenced to a maximum term of imprisonment, and law enforcement officially declared the terrifying saga of the Circleville writer to be fully closed. but the active closing of the legal file ran directly into a massive, terrifying wall of physical contradiction. Following his arrival at the state penitentiary, prison administrators, operating under strict instructions from the Pickaway County Sheriff, placed Paul Freshour under an absolute regime of administrative segregation. He was thrown into a maximum security solitary confinement cell block, a concrete vault designed to isolate high-profile inmates completely from the outside world. Freshour was subjected to continuous 24-hour physical surveillance by multiple correctional officers. His cell was systematically searched multiple times a day, his civilian clothing was entirely confiscated, and he was granted absolute zero access to writing instruments, paper sheets, envelopes, or postal stamps. He was a man completely buried alive within the corrections infrastructure. Yet, within weeks of his absolute isolation, the volume of Circleville letters did not experience a minor drop. It increased with a massive, unprecedented frequency. Hundreds of new letters began pouring into the mailboxes of Circleville residents, written in the exact same, flawless, block-printed capital letters that had defined the original campaign. This terrifying development pushed the case into an absolute investigative deadlock, completely shattering the state's lone wolf perpetrator theory. The new letters did not just continue the old narrative. They began providing highly meticulous, real-time descriptions of Paul Freshour's daily life inside his maximum security isolation cell. The writer documented the exact food tray selections Freshour rejected, the specific minutes he spent in the internal recreation cage, and the precise dates he met with his medical providers. The legal paradigm had completely collapsed. The United States Postal Inspection Service was forced to deploy a highly specialized team of federal investigators to conduct a deep subsurface forensic dive into the physical properties of the ongoing correspondence. They initiated a comprehensive tracking operation, pulling the newly intercepted letters directly from the sorting conveyor lines of the regional Columbus mail facility to conduct an absolute chemical and physical analysis of the artifacts. The forensic laboratory team utilized gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, and infrared spectroscopy to analyze the exact elemental structure of the materials. The handwriting analysis confirmed with mathematical certainty that the unique stroke patterns, spatial angling, and dimensional scaling of the block capitals perfectly mirrored the letters written prior to Freshour's arrest. But it was the chemical evaluation of the fluid that completely shattered the conventional framework of the investigation. The forensic chemists discovered that the ink utilized to print the real-time descriptions of the prison cell was not a standard commercial ballpoint formula. Instead, the fluid consisted of a hyperdense, highly toxic lead-based chemical ink compound containing unique industrial stabilizing binding agents. This specific chemical formula had been completely outlawed from commercial manufacturing and domestic distribution by federal safety regulations since 1920. The true, terrifying sequence of the Circleville letters reconstructed itself from an entirely non-linear angle. Paul Freshour was never the author of the anonymous letters. He was a carefully selected target, framed with absolute precision by the real entity operating the campaign. The .25 caliber handgun utilized in the bus route booby trap had been stolen from his private workshop months prior by an organization that possessed complete access to his property. The true author of the Circleville letters was not an isolated, disgruntled resident writing notes on a kitchen table. The campaign was an automated, institutional operation managed by a deeply entrenched collective within the municipal government infrastructure of Pickaway County itself. The older stocks of toxic lead-based industrial ink and the precise repeating geometry of the block letters were the direct product of an archaic, mechanical routing and addressing machine hidden deep within the restricted document processing basements of a local administrative building. The conspiracy utilized this untraceable institutional machinery to enforce absolute social compliance across the town, systematically collecting the deepest personal secrets of the citizens through extra-legal wiretapping and illegal physical surveillance. When Freshour was placed in solitary confinement, the internal operators within the corrections department simply routed his daily administrative guard logs directly to the document processing team, continuing the letters to prove their absolute, godlike dominance over the community while demonstrating that the legal system had locked away an innocent man. Paul Freshour served 10 years of his maximum sentence before being granted parole, maintaining his absolute innocence until his eventual death in 1994. The Pickaway County Sheriff's Department never reopened the homicide investigation, and no municipal official ever faced formal prosecution or administrative indictment for the physical manufacturing of the lead-based correspondence. The true collective identity of the Circleville writer remains an unsolved vacuum of absolute institutional surveillance that outlived the very generation it terrorized, leaving an enduring, chilling warning that the most dangerous secrets in an American town are often held by the very institutions engineered to protect them. As the paranoid, paper-filled mailboxes of the Ohio suburbs fade into the cold silence of an unresolved conspiracy, we leave the modern grid lines of the Midwest behind. Our journey takes us back into the deep, suffocating isolation of the southern wilderness, where a hand-built brick estate dedicated to the study of the dark arts would become the setting for a prophetic, premeditated bloodbath. The transition from the highly engineered, paranoid paper trails of the Ohio suburbs takes us deep into the suffocating, prehistoric isolation of the deep southern wilderness, where a hand-built brick estate dedicated to the academic study of the occult would become the setting for a prophetic, premeditated bloodbath. We enter the heavy, unmapped forests of Chattooga County, Georgia, in the bleak winter of 1982. This is a region defined by rugged mountain ridges, dense pine canopies that completely swallow the sun, and an insular, deeply traditional rural population that viewed any disruption to their generational lifestyle with immediate aggressive hostility. Deep within this isolation, far down an unpaved, winding logging trail that was completely inaccessible to standard vehicular traffic, sat a massive architectural anomaly known to locals as Corpsewood Manor. The estate was a towering, fortress-like structure constructed entirely of heavy, hand-molded bricks, featuring arched windows, high defensive ramparts, and a design that mirrored a medieval sanctuary rather than a modern southern home. The baseline narrative of this location has been whispered throughout regional true crime circles as a tragic, straightforward case of armed robbery targeting wealthy, eccentric outsiders. But when state homicide detectives and forensic path specialists began systematically dismantling the physical layers of the crime scene, the standard economic motive completely collapsed, unearthing a terrifying chronological paradox that suggests the primary victim had flawlessly anticipated, documented, and calculated every single ballistic detail of his own execution months before the killers even formulated their plot. To understand the profound psychological and social friction that generated this localized catastrophe, the investigation must first reconstruct the unconventional lives and academic backgrounds of the inhabitants. The creator of Corpsewood Manor was Dr. Charles Scudder, a 50-year-old former university professor who possessed an incredibly brilliant, hyper-disciplined mind. For years, Dr. Scudder had operated as a highly respected, tenured professor of pharmacology and toxicology at a major metropolitan university, specializing in the chemical isolation of neurological toxins and the historic properties of ancient herbal medicines. He was a man of immense cultural refinement, an accomplished classical musician, and an avid collector of rare historical texts detailing medieval theology, pagan iconography, and demonology. In the late 1970s, experiencing a profound existential disillusionment with modern academic infrastructure and urban civilization, Dr. Scudder made a radical decision. He liquidated his entire conventional financial portfolio, resigned from his university chair, and retreated into the Georgia wilderness with his partner, Joseph Odom. Together, utilizing their own physical labor, they manually mixed, molded, and fired over 20,000 individual clay bricks from the soil to construct their off-grid fortress. They established a highly insular lifestyle of absolute self-sufficiency, surrounding themselves with a massive, multi-room library containing thousands of rare volumes, high-end laboratory equipment, and a vast collection of custom oil paintings rendered by Dr. Scudder himself. To the insular, deeply religious rural communities of Chattooga County, the brilliant, highly eccentric lifestyle of these two men was viewed through a lens of absolute superstitious panic. Rumors systematically spread throughout the valleys that Corpsewood Manor was a centralized hub for midnight occult rituals, satanic sacrifices, and unholy chemical experiments, transforming the estate into a focus of intense regional paranoia. The baseline stability of the manor was violently shattered in December of 1982, when the deep silence of the surrounding forest was broken by the discovery of a horrific scene. A local associate who routinely traveled to the edge of the property to deliver basic agricultural supplies noted that the heavy reinforced oak entrance doors of the fortress were standing completely ajar, swinging idly in the cold winter wind. Sensing an immediate, severe disruption, the associate retreated down the mountain pass to alert the Pickaway County authorities. When the first responding sheriff's deputies and state troopers breached the interior perimeter of the Grand Hall, they walked directly into a scene of cold, systematic slaughter. The interior environment was completely saturated by an oppressive chemical odor layered with the metallic scent of heavy blood infiltration. In the center of the primary living space, investigators located the bodies of Dr. Scudder and Joseph Odom. The forensic positioning was highly disturbing. Both men had been restrained to heavy, high-backed wooden dining chairs using complex, multi-layered knots of industrial hemp rope. They had been subjected to multiple close-range ballistic entries, exhibiting catastrophic internal trauma. Homicide investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation immediately assumed absolute command of the primary crime scene, initiating a meticulous forensic cataloging of the space. The physical layout of the manor presented immediate, stark contradictions that completely disrupted standard criminal logic. The entire estate had been subjected to a highly chaotic, aggressive ransacking. Desk drawers were shattered across the floorboards, rare historical manuscripts were ripped from their shelves, and cabinet panels were violently broken open. The behavioral patterns suggested that the intruders were searching for a highly concentrated cache of wealth, driven by local rumors that the wealthy former professor had buried hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash beneath the brick flooring. Yet, the forensic technicians noted that the perpetrators had left behind thousands of dollars worth of easily liquidable, high-value assets, priceless historical silver artifacts, expensive gold-trim occult relics, and thousands of dollars in delicate, high-end, university-grade laboratory gear sat completely undisturbed on the side counters. The physical evidence revealed that the killers had fled the scene with nothing more than a few loose civilian dollars pulled from a common kitchen container and a small collection of historical coin samples. The sheer disproportion between the hyper-violent execution of the victims and the pathetic financial reward suggested an investigative void that standard theories of armed robbery could not bridge. The early phase of the state investigation focused heavily on the regional rumors of occult warfare, leading the GBI down a series of massive, highly public red herrings. Driven by the intense early 1980s satanic panic that was currently gripping the United States judicial system, detectives pursued the hypothesis that the double homicide was the direct result of a ritualistic execution managed by a rival network of occult practitioners, or a radical local vigilante group seeking to purge the county of alleged heresy. The authorities conducted sweeping interrogations across the rural townships, targeting local survivalists, anti-eccentric religious groups, and regional bootleggers who operated illegal manufacturing stills within the deep valleys of Chattooga County. Several local youths who had publicly expressed intense hostility toward Dr. Scudder's lifestyle were brought into administrative custody for intensive behavioral tracking. The local press leaned into these theories with aggressive sensationalism, publishing graphic descriptions of the manor's pagan iconography and suggesting that the victims had fallen prey to the very dark forces they studied. But as the ballistics results and fingerprint matching profiles began returning from the Central State Laboratory, the ritualistic execution theory completely dissolved. The tool marks on the broken cabinetry and the physical entry trajectories of the bullets did not possess the calculated ceremonial precision of a ritual hit. They were the messy, frantic indicators of low-level, chemically impaired local thieves operating in a state of absolute, adrenaline-fueled panic. The investigation hit an absolute historical deadlock as every primary suspect checked out with verified, airtight alibis for the night of the executions. The critical turning point of the case occurred on a freezing afternoon 2 weeks following the initial discovery, when the lead GBI state investigator and a senior forensic pathologist returned to the sealed library of Corpsewood Manor to conduct a final, exhaustive cataloging of the estate's extensive custom art collection. The investigator turned his attention to a massive finished oil painting resting on a heavy iron easel directly in the center of the master library hall. The canvas was exceptionally large, rendered in hyper-realistic, vivid oil pigments that stood out starkly against the dark timber shelving of the room. The piece had been completely overlooked during the initial chaotic processing of the blood spatter patterns because it was assumed to be just another example of Dr. Scudder's eccentric artistic portfolio. But as the forensic pathologist brushed away a layer of fine dust from the upper margin of the frame and adjusted a specialized, high-intensity light grid across the surface of the canvas, the absolute, mind-bending reality of the physical evidence forced a complete reevaluation of the timeline. The scene, beautifully, flawlessly rendered on the oil canvas, was not a mythical scene, a theological illustration, or a pagan allegory. It was a perfect, high-fidelity forensic reconstruction of the active crime scene itself. The painting depicted Dr. Charles Scudder and Joseph Odom bound tightly to the exact same style of high-backed wooden dining chairs they were discovered in, utilizing the identical structural knotwork and rope patterns that the state technicians had cataloged during the initial sweep. More chillingly, the painting displayed an absolute, mathematically precise mapping of the ballistics and entry trauma. On the painted canvas, the image of Dr. Scudder's chest featured the exact number of entry wounds, down to the millimeter placement, that the forensic medical examiner had documented in the final autopsy results. The positioning of the cranial trauma, the dynamic flow of the postmortem fluid lines, and the precise trajectory of the geometric blood spatter patterns matching the brick wall behind them were mirrored on the canvas with a precision that could only be achieved by a trained forensic artist standing directly over the bodies. In the lower right corner, the canvas featured Dr. Scudder's signature, executed in his distinct, formal, cursive script, dated exactly 6 months prior to the intrusion. October 1982. Directly beneath the date, he had painted a handwritten inscription, "The Uninvited Guests." The discovery completely shattered the traditional linear understanding of the homicide, pushing the state detectives to reconstruct the final months of the victims' lives through a deeply unsettling lens. Dr. Scudder was not a helpless victim caught off guard by a random home invasion. Utilizing his profound, world-class background in pharmacology, biochemistry, and advanced toxicology, he had been conducting highly controlled, experimental neurological isolation trials using rare chemical compounds extracted from the deep swamp flora of the property. His private research logs, hidden behind a false panel in the library casing, revealed that he had successfully synthesized a specialized, non-traditional neurochemical agent that completely altered the human brain's perception of temporal linearity. The compound induced a state of hyperlucid continuous cognitive displacement, allowing his consciousness to experience future physical events as immediate, tangible realities. 6 months prior to his death, during a hyperlucid state induced by the compound, Dr. Scudder had witnessed the absolute sequence of his own demise. He did not attempt to alter the timeline or flee the estate, operating under a profound toxicological understanding that the physical event was mathematically locked into the structural framework of space-time. Instead, he chose to utilize his refined artistic talents to create a permanent, unalterable physical monument of the future crime scene. The painting was never intended as a piece of art. It was a deliberate, flawless forensic blueprint left behind to guide the state investigators directly to the executioners. As the detectives utilized macrolens photography to analyze the dark, hyper-saturated shadows painted into the background canvas of the living hall, they discovered that Dr. Scudder had painted 2 distinct, semi-obscured human faces peering through the arched windows of the manor. The faces did not possess the idealized features of classical portraiture. They were highly realistic, distinct biometric renderings of 2 specific local youths, down to the unique scar lines along their jaws and the precise structure of their eyes. When the GBI cross-referenced these painted portraits against local criminal database photographs, they immediately identified 2 local laborers who had briefly visited the perimeter of the estate months earlier to deliver building materials. The youths were immediately apprehended in a coordinated state raid. When confronted with the oil painting in the interrogation room, they suffered a complete psychological collapse, confessing to the exact sequence of entry, binding, and ballistic execution that Dr. Scudder had flawlessly recorded on canvas months before they had even conceptualized the crime. The legal proceedings were concluded with absolute speed, and both individuals were sentenced to consecutive life terms within the maximum security state corrections system, where they remain incarcerated to this day. The structural framework of Corpsewood Manor was completely abandoned by the state, slowly reclaimed by the dense, aggressive growth of the Georgia wilderness, its hand-molded bricks gradually crumbling into the damp soil. Today, the ruins stand as a silent, heavily avoided void within the forest, a physical testament to a crime that was perfectly anticipated by the mind of its primary subject. As the crumbling brick ramparts of the ruined manor fade into the dark, suffocating canopy of the southern forest, we leave the blood-stained easel behind. Our journey takes us far to the west, climbing into the sun-blinded valleys of Northern California, where another immense inheritance would be weaponized to engineer a sprawling architectural machine designed to cage the phantoms of an entire nation. The tragic premonitory brushstrokes of Corpsewood Manor leave a lingering chill in the silent canopy of the Georgia woods, proving that some physical structures can act as canvas, matching the darkest designs of the human mind. Our journey now takes a massive spatial leap across the American continent, leaving the remote southern wilderness behind and entering the sun-blinded, windswept valleys of Northern California. We look into the late 19th century within the borders of San Jose, a region defined by sprawling fruit orchards, rolling coastal hills, and a rapidly developing upper-class society. Within this landscape, a massive architectural phenomenon began to rise out of the earth, a structure that would eventually contain 160 individual rooms, thousands of windows, and a design so inherently chaotic that it would puzzle structural engineers, historians, and psychiatrists for over a century. The baseline lore of this location has been cemented in American pop culture as a simple, tragic ghost story of a guilt-ridden widow attempting to outrun the phantoms of the old Western frontier. But when a multidisciplinary team of structural engineers, historical researchers, and acoustic physicists recently finalized a comprehensive technological mapping of the estate, the traditional narrative of madness and superstition completely dissolved. They unearthed a hidden physical blueprint that shifted the entire case into a mind-bending mechanical reality, proving that the resident had not built a labyrinth out of an unhinged mind, but had accidentally constructed a massive, self-perpetuating psychological machine that generated the very demons she spent her entire life trying to satisfy. The foundational framework of this architectural mystery was established in the winter of 1884, following an absolute sequence of devastating personal tragedies that completely dismantled the psychology of its creator. Sarah Winchester was an exceptionally refined, highly educated woman, originally from New Haven, Connecticut. She was a person of immense intellect, fluent in multiple classical languages, deeply well-versed in architectural design, and a master of classical music instrumentation. She had married into absolute global prominence when she wed William Wirt Winchester, the direct heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company fortune. The wealth backing this industrial empire was astronomical, but it was wealth that was directly baptized in the catastrophic ballistic trauma, shattered bone structures, and extensive blood spatter of the battlefields of the American Civil West. The repeating rifle had pulverized conventional military tactics and left a trail of immense human destruction in its wake. The personal life of the Winchester family suffered an equally absolute devastation. The couple's infant daughter succumbed to a sudden, acute wasting disease, and years later, William passed away abruptly from an aggressive case of pulmonary tuberculosis. Sarah was left entirely isolated within a vacuum of profound grief, inheriting an absolute financial fortune consisting of over $20 million and a continuous 50% ownership stake in the firearms manufacturing giant. Seeking an escape from the suffocating memories of the East Coast, Sarah consulted a highly prominent spiritualist medium residing in Boston. The medium delivered a terrifying, absolute ultimatum that would permanently dictate the remaining 38 years of Sarah's physical existence. The spiritualist declared that the Winchester lineage was under an absolute, multi-generational curse, targeted by the collective fury of thousands of spirits whose physical bodies had been pulverized and destroyed by the family's repeating rifles. The medium swore that the only method to avoid an immediate, violent post-mortem retribution was for Sarah to liquidate her properties, travel west toward the setting sun, and continuously build a massive home to contain the displaced phantoms. The medium issued a final, chilling rule. The construction must occur 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, without a single minute of cessation. If the sound of the carpenter's hammers ever stopped completely, the line between the physical world and the spiritual void would collapse, and Sarah would instantly suffer a fatal medical event. Terrified by the prospect of this metaphysical retribution, the wealthy widow packed her bags, traveled to the Santa Clara Valley of California, and purchased an unengineered, simple 8-room farmhouse, completely setting the stage for a decades-long descent into spatial madness. The incident of this case is defined by the continuous 38-year transformation of that simple farmhouse into a sprawling, multi-story structural labyrinth. For over 3 decades, a rotating force of dozens of local carpenters, master masons, and structural laborers worked in continuous 12-hour shifts, executing architectural directives that appeared to possess absolute zero logical alignment. When the first outside surveyors, corporate lawyers, and historical biographers were finally permitted to cross the threshold of the property following Sarah's eventual passing, the true scope of the spatial madness was officially discovered. The estate was a physical manifestation of a chaotic nightmare. Walking through the interior environment, investigators discovered staircases that climbed multiple stories only to terminate abruptly against solid, impenetrable plaster ceilings. They opened beautifully, finished, expensive mahogany doors that revealed absolute vertical drops directly onto the hard concrete of the central courtyards below. Blind hallways zigzagged at impossible angles, narrowing until a human body could no longer squeeze through the framing. Masterfully crafted brick chimneys climbed through the center of the residence, only to terminate exactly 2 inches before breaching the roofline. Ornamental columns were installed upside down, with their capitals anchoring the baseboards, and rooms were built entirely within the interior framing of larger rooms, creating a hyperdense physical maze that defied every established law of domestic architecture. The active investigation into the structural psychology of the Winchester residence was pursued for over a century by prominent historians, architectural critics, and psychiatric evaluators. The universal consensus, the great historical red herring of the case, was that Sarah Winchester was simply an unhinged, eccentric experiencing a profound, prolonged state of psychological unhinging driven by survivor's guilt and overwhelming grief. The mainstream biographical accounts argued that her complete lack of formal structural blueprinting, combined with her daily reliance on automated automatic writing sessions during midnight seances, caused her to build a direct physical mirror of a fragmented, disorganized mind. The experts claimed that she was intentionally designing architectural blind spots, trick doors, and maze-like corridors to physically confuse and trap the vengeful phantoms of the rifle victims, preventing them from locating her private sleeping quarters. This explanation seemed completely flawless, neatly categorizing the bizarre residence as a tragic monument to upper-class superstition and a profound mental breakdown. The public universally accepted the narrative of the crazy widow, transforming the mansion into a highly lucrative commercial roadside oddity where tourists could laugh at the nonsensical placements of the staircases and doors. But the long-standing red herring completely collapsed when a modern research cooperative consisting of senior structural engineers, advanced acoustic physicists, and historical microgeographers secured permission to execute a comprehensive, high-technology diagnostic scan of the entire building. The research team did not rely on traditional visual inspections or simple historical diaries. Instead, they deployed state-of-the-art 3-dimensional X-ray imagery grids, terrestrial laser radar arrays, and hypersensitive digital acoustic monitoring sensors designed to capture the absolute vibrational telemetry of the interior spaces. Their primary objective was to discover whether the underlying foundation of the mansion possessed any hidden structural stability issues, unrecorded cavities, or deliberate engineering patterns that could explain why the chaotic construction had maintained such structural resilience despite multiple major California seismic events. The processing of the 3-dimensional X-ray telemetry data pushed the investigation into an absolute, mind-bending breakthrough, completely dismantling a century of psychological assumptions. The advanced digital imaging revealed that the chaotic placement of the corridors, the blind ceilings, and the trick doors was not a random, unengineered manifestation of madness. Beneath the surface aesthetics sat a highly complex, mathematically precise acoustic blueprint. The structural engineers discovered that the narrow, winding hallways functioned collectively as an array of industrial acoustic pipes. The long, hollow vertical drops behind the false doors acted as natural amplification chambers, and the specific geometric angling of the thousands of custom glass windows was oriented to capture the prevailing environmental winds that routinely swept down from the mountains and through the Santa Clara Valley. The entire framework of the 160 rooms had been engineered either by design or by an incredible sequence of accidental structural reinforcement to function as a massive, unified low-frequency physical infrasound resonator. The true mechanical reality of the Winchester Mystery House reconstructed itself from a terrifying non-linear angle, revealing a chronological horror story that completely upends the understanding of Sarah's life. Sarah Winchester was never a crazy woman building a maze out of an unhinged mind. She was the tragic victim of a massive, self-engineered acoustic weapon. Every night, at precisely midnight, operating under her strict spiritualist protocols, Sarah would lock herself entirely alone inside the Blue Room, a small, highly resonant chamber located at the absolute geometric center of the massive labyrinth. As the late-night coastal winds hit the exterior facade of the mansion at specific environmental velocities, the structural corridors, hollow drops, and upside-down columns funneled, condensed, and amplified the wind energy, projecting a continuous acoustic wave directly into the central chamber. The forensic sensors confirmed that the house was physically generating a steady, unbroken infrasound frequency of exactly 7 Hz. Medical science and neuroacoustic research prove that continuous exposure to a 7 Hz infrasound frequency has a devastating, predictable impact on the human body and cognitive processing. A 7 Hz vibration matches the exact resonant frequency of the human internal organs and the physical structure of the eyeball itself. When a human subject is placed within this active acoustic field, the low-frequency waves physically vibrate the vestibulo-ocular system, directly generating severe visual hallucinations, including the optical illusion of gray, moving shadows in the peripheral vision. The frequency causes the internal mechanics of the inner ear to distort, translating to the brain as distinct auditory hallucinations of heavy phantom footsteps, distant whispers, and mechanical hammering sounds. Furthermore, the vibration triggers an immediate, systemic autonomic nervous system response, flooding the subject's body with adrenaline, inducing an intense state of existential dread, overwhelming paranoia, and a profound drops in localized body temperature that manifests as sudden, localized freezing drafts. Reenacting the absolute sequence of her daily life reveals the true horror of her 38-year confinement. Sarah would sit in the darkness of the seance room, and as the house began to resonate at 7 Hz, her eyeballs would physically vibrate, causing her to see the gray shapes of rifle victims moving through the corners of her vision. Her inner ear would distort, causing her to hear the distinct heavy footsteps of invisible intruders walking down the adjacent blind corridors. Her body would freeze, and her brain would experience a state of absolute chemical paranoia. She believed with absolute certainty that she was being actively visited by thousands of vengeful spirits demanding more rooms, more corridors, and more stairs. The next morning, she would hand her carpenters frantic instructions to build more chaotic additions to appease the phantoms, but by constructing more narrow hallways, more hollow drops, and more angled windows, she was physically expanding the internal acoustic resonance pipeline of the machine. The house was a massive, growing psychological loop. The more she built, the more powerful the 7 Hz infrasound weapon became, and the more intense her terrifying hallucinations grew, driving her to build continuously until her physical body simply failed. She had accidentally constructed a physical machine that continuously manufactured the very demons she spent her entire life attempting to outrun. Sarah Winchester passed away quietly in her sleep on September 5, 1922, from an acute case of heart failure, and the sounds of the carpenter's hammers instantly ceased, leaving the massive labyrinth frozen in time. The legal execution of her will revealed that her vast financial fortune had been entirely depleted by the continuous 38-year construction expenditures, leaving her bank accounts completely empty and the proprietary rights to the firearms company fractured among corporate entities. Today, the residence stands as a world-famous commercial destination, a massive monument to architectural madness that continues to draw thousands of oblivious tourists across its threshold. But for the acoustic scientists and engineers who have mapped the true physical telemetry of the framing, the silent corridors of the mansion stand as a chilling warning of how easily an elite intellect can engineer its own prison, leaving an enduring physical monument where the wind itself continues to manufacture phantoms within the walls of a forgotten kingdom. As the chaotic, echoing roof lines of the California mansion fade into the sun-blinded silence of the valley, we leave the haunted architecture behind. Our journey takes us back toward the heart of the American Midwest, moving out of the coastal sun and entering the quiet industrial residential blocks of a small 20th century town, where an invisible, Toxic Phantom would turn the simple act of breathing inside a bedroom into a terrifying struggle against an uncontainable predator. The discovery that the mechanical vibrations of an expansive California residence could be engineered to continuously manufacture phantoms within the human mind leaves a lingering chill in the air, proving that the spaces we occupy can easily become weaponized against our psychological stability. Our journey now takes another massive chronological and geographic shift, leaving the coastal sunshine of the West Coast behind and moving directly into the heavy, industrial heartland of the American Midwest. We enter the quiet, layout-mapped neighborhoods of Mattoon, Illinois, during the late twilight of 1944. This was a community deeply defined by its proximity to cross-country railway junctions, heavy manufacturing foundries, and a highly disciplined population that operated around the clock to support the domestic defense production line during the final, exhausting stages of the Second World War. Because the local factories maintained continuous shifts, the streets were accustomed to the distant, rhythmic sounds of machinery and the regular movement of workers under the cover of darkness. But during a volatile 2-week window in early September of 1944, the simple, trusted act of closing the bedroom windows against the late summer humidity transformed into an exercise in absolute terror. An invisible, completely silent predator began navigating the residential blocks, turning the domestic sanctuaries of the town into suffocating containment traps. To understand the profound structural and psychological vulnerability that allowed this anomaly to paralyze the community, the narrative must first reconstruct the daily living conditions and environmental baseline of Mattoon during the autumn of 1944. The town was a dense network of modest, single-story frame houses and small brick bungalows situated in close proximity to local industrial chemical plants and manufacturing facilities. Because the air inside these residential blocks was heavily saturated by the summer heat and industrial smoke, families routinely kept their ground floor bedroom windows propped open several inches, relying on simple wire screens to permit air circulation while they slept. The social fabric of the neighborhoods was exceptionally tight-knit. Everyone knew the shifting work schedules of their neighbors, and the community functioned with a high degree of mutual trust and predictability. It was an environment where safety was treated as an absolute certainty. But this systemic trust was violently shattered on the night of September 1st, 1944, when a localized residential block experienced a completely unclassifiable chemical intrusion that defied standard criminal methodology. The pattern of the anomaly emerged in the empty hours of the early morning, completely bypassing traditional physical security barriers. The perpetrator did not utilize kinetic force to breach the structures. There were no jimmied locks, no shattered window panes, and no indicators of forced architectural entry. Instead, a sleeping family unit was abruptly jolted awake by the sudden infiltration of a highly unusual chemical odor drifting through the wire screen of their open bedroom window. The scent was described by the victims as sickeningly sweet, thick, and chemically artificial, resembling the concentrated essence of decaying floral arrangements or a heavy industrial solvent. Within seconds of inhaling the airborne vapor, the family experienced a sudden, catastrophic physiological reaction. The adult occupants' attempts to rise from their mattress, only to discover that their lower extremities had been rendered completely immobile by an acute temporary paralysis. Their vocal cords were structurally constricted, preventing them from shouting for assistance, while their throats suffered an immediate, severe respiratory swelling accompanied by intense nausea. As the primary victim desperately struggled to drag her paralyzed frame toward the window casing, she shined a small flashlight through the screen mesh, capturing a fleeting, highly disturbing visual profile in the dim moonlight. Standing directly in the shadows of the exterior garden plot was a tall, motionless human silhouette dressed entirely in black civilian garments, holding a long, metallic cylindrical nozzle designed to project a pressurized stream of vapor directly into the interior framing of the bedroom before melting completely into the darkness of the industrial blocks. Within 48 hours, the emergency switchboards of the Coles County authorities were completely flooded by dozens of identical, frantic reports coming from entirely separate residential sectors across the town. The layout of the attacks demonstrated a calculated, non-linear progression that completely paralyzed the local infrastructure. In every single instance, the sequence of events matched with absolute accuracy. A family would wake to the sickeningly sweet chemical odor, suffer immediate temporary paralysis of their limbs, experience acute respiratory constriction, and note the fleeting trace of a dark figure escaping through the rear alleyways. The public's fear of Mattoon rapidly descended into a state of absolute, localized panic. Citizen defense committees were organized to patrol the streets with shotguns, families boarded up their ground floor windows despite the suffocating heat, and the local workforce suffered massive absenteeism as residents refused to leave their households unprotected against an invisible toxic phantom. The active investigation fell under the immediate operational command of Coles County Sheriff C.E. Cole, a veteran law enforcement officer who found himself navigating a massive administrative nightmare. As his detective units processed the primary crime scenes, they ran directly into absolute, frustrating physical contradictions. Despite the density of the reported attacks, the forensic technicians could locate absolute zero physical evidence to support a traditional industrial or chemical assault. There were no discarded chemical canisters, no residue drops on the external windowsills, and no trace footprints left behind in the soft soil of the garden plots where the dark silhouette had been witnessed. Seeking to regain administrative control over the escalating public hysteria, Sheriff Cole convened an emergency panel consisting of senior municipal toxicologists, industrial safety inspectors, and mainstream psychological consultants from the state university. The panel formulated a swift, comprehensive public conclusion that would serve as the great historical red herring of the case. They officially declared that the entire phenomenon of the mad gasser of Mattoon was a textbook manifestation of mass hysteria and collective sociological suggestion. The mainstream toxicologists argued that it was scientifically impossible for a lone criminal actor to manufacture and deploy a highly volatile, paralyzing chemical gas through an open window screen without leaving behind detectable atmospheric signatures or suffering self-inflicted chemical exposure. The psychological consultants presented extensive diagnostic profiles suggesting that the intense domestic strains, factory fatigue, and pervasive anxieties of the ongoing global war had created a hypersuggestible public consciousness. They claimed that an initial, routine industrial emissions leak from a local defense manufacturing plant had caused a localized family to imagine an attack, and the subsequent sensationalized press coverage had caused a chain reaction where classic anxiety-induced hyperventilation and psychosomatic paralysis were being manufactured by the citizens themselves. The authorities officially closed the active criminal files, ordering the local press to cease publishing reports of the gas intrusions, and dismissed the entire case as a temporary psychological breakdown of a wartime industrial town. But the active administrative closing of the case ran directly into a massive, terrifying wall of physical and biological contradiction. Decades following the incident, independent historical researchers, investigative journalists, and toxicological archivists secured legal access to the private personal journals, confidential unredacted field ledgers, and restricted laboratory receipts kept exclusively by Sheriff Cole during that precise autumn of 1944. These highly sensitive state documents had been systematically scrubbed and omitted from the public municipal archives to protect the strategic economic operations of the local defense manufacturing foundries. When the research teams began translating the sheriff's private handwritten daily entries, the true, mind-bending reality of the chemical attacks completely upended the historical mass hysteria theory, unearthing an unclassified corporate and military nightmare. The confidential official logs revealed that while the public toxicologists were claiming absolute zero physical evidence existed at the scenes, the sheriff's internal deployment teams were cataloging a terrifying biological disaster along the perimeters of the affected neighborhoods. Reenacting the absolute sequence of the true investigation from the secret ledgers reveals a sequence of events that standard psychological suggestion cannot account for. On every single night an individual household reported a late-night chemical gas intrusion, the sheriff's deputies conducting the immediate exterior sweeps discovered that the entire domestic animal, livestock, and avian population within a strict, mathematically precise 2-mile radius of the target home had suffered absolute simultaneous biological eradication. Hundreds of neighborhood dogs, stray cats, domestic cattle, and wild birds were discovered dead along the wooden perimeter fences and barn structures, showing absolute zero signs of external kinetic trauma, lacerations, or predator intervention. To determine the true cause of this massive biological kill-off, Sheriff Cole had authorized a series of post-mortem veterinary autopsies conducted in total absolute secrecy within a highly restricted university pathology laboratory. The official autopsy results completely shattered the mass hysteria red herring. The state path specialists documented that the respiratory systems and pulmonary tissues of the deceased animals had undergone a rapid, unnatural mutation. The lungs had not filled with fluid due to standard suffocation. Instead, the entire internal cellular architecture of the respiratory organs had been physically condensed and transformed into highly altered, dense blocks of a distinct, blue-tinted, chemical-laden gelatin. This absolute physical anomaly proved with scientific certainty that the environment had been saturated by a hyper-concentrated, highly advanced synthetic airborne agent that possessed an immense capability to rapidly fix and solidify biological protein structures upon direct inhalation. Mass hysteria can easily induce a psychosomatic drops in human blood pressure or trigger hyperventilation, but collective human suggestion cannot physically turn the internal pulmonary tissue of a neighborhood canine into a dense block of blue industrial gelatin. The secret journals mapped the reasoning process of Sheriff Cole as he realized the true, terrifying nature of the Phantom Prowler. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon was never a single, eccentric criminal mastermind operating out of a hidden basement laboratory, and it was never a mass hallucination of a stressed public. The intrusions were the direct byproduct of a catastrophic industrial system failure occurring deep within a specialized, highly classified chemical defense research project managed under a joint corporate and black-budget military infrastructure contract inside one of the town's largest local manufacturing complexes. The facility was actively attempting to synthesize a non-kinetic, localized neurochemical security agent designed to instantly neutralize enemy troop movements by inducing temporary respiratory paralysis without causing immediate human fatalities. But the compound possessed an extreme structural instability. During the high humidity conditions of early September, a massive, unrecorded breach occurred within the underground pressurized storage conduits of the facility, allowing the hyperdense, sweet-smelling vapor to leak into the low-lying neighborhood blocks under specific late-night atmospheric conditions. The tall, dark silhouette witnessed holding the metallic nozzle was not a criminal predator. It was a specialized industrial containment and monitoring team dispatched in total secrecy by the corporation, utilizing a vacuum recovery apparatus to measure the precise toxicity dispersion vectors across the sleeping residential blocks while using the human residents as unconsenting live test subjects. The official mass hysteria narrative was a brilliant, highly calculated piece of institutional psychological warfare designed to completely invalidate the physical testimonies of the citizens, shield the defense infrastructure from multi-million-dollar legal liabilities, and protect the classified chemical research project from foreign intelligence discovery. The legal and pathological files detailing the blue pulmonary gelatin mutations were permanently sealed under national security classifications, and no corporate executive or municipal official ever faced formal prosecution, judicial indictment, or administrative penalty for the chemical exposure of the population of Mattoon. The physical leaks eventually ceased as the factory re-engineered its underground pressure valves before the onset of the winter freeze, leaving the survivors to live out their remaining decades with chronic respiratory vulnerabilities and memories that were officially categorized as a collective madness. The true history of the Midwestern town remains a chilling, unredacted testament to how easily the machinery of state security can manufacture a lie to consume the truth, leaving an enduring warning that the air we breathe inside our own bedrooms can be completely compromised by the invisible machinery operating just beyond the tree line. As the quiet, toxic streets of the Illinois manufacturing town fade into the cold archive of a forgotten industrial cover-up, we leave the silent foundries behind. Our journey takes us back toward the historic heart of the American South, moving away from the 20th century factories and entering the moss-draped, swamp-bordered blocks of an old 19th century settlement where a condemned woman's final, vengeful breath would ignite a catastrophic countdown that no modern force could intercept. The transition from the invisible, toxic chemical clouds of the Midwestern manufacturing blocks takes us back toward the historic, moss-draped lowlands of the American South. We move away from the 20th century factories and enter the humid, swamp-bordered blocks of an old 19th century river settlement, where a condemned woman's final, vengeful breath would ignite a catastrophic chronological countdown that no modern safety infrastructure could intercept. We enter the heavily isolated, waterlogged landscapes of Yazoo City, Mississippi during the late twilight of the 19th century. This was a territory deeply defined by its unique geographical positioning along the edge of the massive Mississippi Delta, a region where a booming economic trade in cotton and timber was constantly pushing against the boundaries of a primordial, untouched wilderness. The physical layout of the town was completely bounded by the winding tracks of the Yazoo River and its adjacent networks of dense cypress swamps, places where Spanish moss hung from the branches like decayed lace, and where the humid air was permanently thick with the scent of river mud, sulfur, and decaying organic matter. Within this insular, highly traditional river community, a deep-seated reliance on social conformity and religious orthodoxy operated as the primary shield against the unknown dangers of the surrounding wilderness. But deep within the interior of the swamp tracts, living in absolute isolation from the developing civic layout of the town, resided an elderly, highly reclusive woman whose true lineage, legal name, and historical background were completely unrecorded in the local parish registries. To the citizens of Yazoo City, her presence on the absolute margins of the bayou was a source of constant, low-level public anxiety, setting the stage for a localized historical trauma that would wait exactly 20 years to claim its ultimate retribution. The foundational framework of this Southern Gothic mystery was established in the late winter of 1884. The social friction between the town center and the swamp track had reached an absolute boiling point due to a series of unexplained, separate disappearances tracking across the local workforce. Several traveling merchants, riverboat deckhands, and local laborers had vanished entirely after walking toward the outer plantation lines adjacent to the bayou. Rumors systematically circulated through the riverfront saloons and crowded docks that the reclusive woman was actively utilizing non-traditional herbal compounds, toxic root extracts, and ancient chemical mixtures to induce states of severe cognitive disorientation and complete physical paralysis in her victims, luring them into her remote cabin to subject them to prolonged psychological trauma before their deaths. In the late months of 1884, experiencing a state of absolute superstitious panic, an armed vigilante force consisting of prominent town merchants and local law enforcement deputies conducted an aggressive, unmapped raid into the deep interior of the swamp. They successfully tracked the woman through the dense undergrowth, cornering her at the absolute edge of a treacherous subterranean quicksand bog. In her frantic attempt to evade immediate physical capture by the armed mob, the woman miscalculated the stability of the waterlogged terrain, stepping directly into a hyperdense deposit of mud and liquefying silt. As the immense suction of the bog slowly, cleanly pulled her physical frame downward into the earth, she did not manifest panic, and she did not plead for her survival. Instead, as the muddy water reached her throat, she utilized her remaining respiratory volume to scream a highly calculated, terrifying chronological countdown directed at the watching crowd. She swore that her consciousness would remain bound within the root systems of the landscape, and that she would return to the exact coordinates of the town square precisely 20 years to the day to reduce the entire civilization to absolute ash. Her death was quickly classified by the active county coroner as an unpreventable accidental suffocation, and her physical remains were eventually recovered and interred within the elevated borders of Glenwood Cemetery. To prevent superstitious locals from tampering with the site, the civic leaders authorized the installation of massive, heavy iron security chains wrapped symmetrically around her stone monument, completely anchoring the vault beneath the soil. The chronological countdown reached its absolute, premeditated conclusion on May 25, 1904, exactly 20 years to the day following the execution of the Swamp Bog confrontation. The spring season had been exceptionally dry and hot across the Delta, leaving the extensive timber framing of the commercial district uniquely vulnerable to fire hazards. Without a single indicator of meteorological activity, localized lightning strikes, or atmospheric electrical discharge, a catastrophic fire erupted with unprecedented velocity directly from the interior walls of a modest residential structure located on the absolute perimeter of the town center. Within a matter of minutes, the localized blaze transformed into a sweeping, uncontainable thermal wave that systematically marched through the dense commercial blocks of Yazoo City. The specialized firefighting apparatus of the era was rendered entirely useless by the sheer anomalous intensity of the heat. Surviving eyewitnesses and local operators reported that the flames possessed a highly unusual chemical-like color spectrum, burning with a brilliant, blinding blue intensity that appeared to actively liquefy iron window latches and glass panes upon direct contact. The delta winds acted as a massive acoustic bellows, driving the thermal wave across the roofs with a deafening roar. By the time the sun set over the ruined valley, over 200 individual businesses, the Grand Municipal City Hall, the Central Commercial Banking Vaults, and the entire Public Administrative Archive had been reduced to absolute smoldering fields of black ash, completely paralyzing the economic infrastructure of the community. On the morning following the total suppression of the Great Fire, a specialized team of state fire marshals, commercial insurance investigators, and structural path specialists arrived from the capital city of Jackson to initiate a comprehensive forensic evaluation of the disaster track. The primary units immediately pursued a series of entirely conventional material explanations, focusing heavily on standard physical liabilities that served as the great historical red herring of the case. They argued that the destruction of Yazoo City was simply the predictable, mathematical result of poor architectural planning and structural negligence. The official fire marshal reports noted that the historic commercial center consisted exclusively of high-density, uninsulated dry pine timber frames constructed in immediate proximity to one another, creating a natural fuel matrix. They hypothesized that a common domestic accident, a tipped kerosene heating lamp inside a kitchen, or an unattenuated ember from a localized laundry stove, had intersected with the high-velocity delta winds to generate a standard urban firestorm. Detective units focused their investigative tracking on disgruntled riverboat crews and local labor agitators, attempting to construct a traditional profile of criminal arson fueled by economic grievances. This material explanation was highly comfortable for the municipal authorities, offering a simple, non-anomalous narrative that completely erased any connection to the local folklore surrounding the 20-year countdown of 1884. But the comfortable red herring of structural negligence completely collapsed on the afternoon of May 26th, when a small contingent of anxious town leaders, accompanied by a county deputy and a senior medical examiner, traveled to the elevated ridges of Glenwood Cemetery to inspect the historical burial plots. When the verification team reached the isolated coordinates of the condemned woman's gravesite, they walked directly into a forensic anomaly that completely paralyzed their rational reasoning process. The massive, heavy stone monument marking her internment had been violently fractured and split apart from its foundation. More chillingly, the heavy iron security chains, featuring links as thick as a human wrist, that had been wrapped meticulously around the stone to anchor the burial vault, had been cleanly severed. The forensic path specialists noted that the iron links did not manifest any tool marks, saw abrasions, or indicators of external manipulation by heavy metal prying levers. Instead, the heavy iron chains had been violently snapped outward and pushed apart by an immense volumetric pressure originating from directly beneath the subterranean burial vault itself, as if the earth had forcefully, physically rejected the post-mortem contents of the tomb. This terrifying discovery forced the state fire marshals to abandon their traditional arson profiles and initiate a deep subsurface chemical and geographic mapping of the entire 2-mile destruction track, utilizing advanced analysis protocols to evaluate the elemental composition of the ash fields. The results of the laboratory tests completely upended traditional fire science, revealing a non-linear sequence of events that matched the old folklore with terrifying accuracy. The marshals discovered that the Great Fire had not spread through atmospheric embers carried by the delta winds as originally reported. Instead, the primary thermal trajectory had traveled exclusively underground, moving along a specific, interconnected biological pipeline consisting of decayed cypress root systems and ancient subterranean marsh gas pockets that sat directly beneath the town's foundation. As the forensic teams meticulously traced these underground ignition paths back to their absolute source, they discovered that the thermal vectors originated directly from the boundary lines of Glenwood Cemetery. Furthermore, as the investigators cleared away the fresh soot covering the cellar floors of the ruined City Hall, they located a physical trace that completely shattered the mass hysteria hypothesis. Imprinted deep into the hardened gray ash was a continuous, sequential tracking path consisting of a single set of bare, asymmetric footprints belonging to an elderly woman. The forensic layout of the stride marks revealed that the entity had moved in a flawless, deliberate linear trajectory from the ruptured burial vault directly through the administrative center of the town and straight back into the primordial mud of the Yazoo River swamp. The chemical analysis of the organic soil left inside the footprints revealed a hyperdense concentration of prehistoric swamp minerals and highly altered vegetation compounds, the exact biological signature of the unique quicksand bog that had consumed the woman exactly 24 years prior. The fire was never an architectural accident. It was a deeply delayed, chemically accelerated act of ecological and spiritual vengeance. The woman's consciousness, bound within the waterlogged root matrices of the valley since 1884, had utilized the 20-year incubation cycle to systematically transform the natural subterranean methane networks beneath the town into a massive, highly synchronized ignition pipeline, perfectly executing her final respiratory threat the moment the chronological clock struck its conclusion. The official state records for the Great Yazoo City Fire of 1904 were permanently closed and classified under a restrictive administrative protocol, categorized strictly as an unpreventable natural accident caused by an unmapped pockets of volatile marsh gas to prevent a total abandonment of the Delta territory by commercial land developers and timber corporations. The commercial district was eventually reconstructed using heavy, fire-resistant brick and reinforced stone, completely replacing the old timber frames of the 19th century to build a modern infrastructure shield. But the elevated ridges of Glenwood Cemetery remain a permanent void of absolute public avoidance within the layout of the community, a location where local citizens universally refuse to linger after the sun sets over the bayou. The shattered iron chains rest today exactly where they were discovered, a chilling physical monument to a vengeance that completely invalidated the boundaries of the grave, leaving an enduring historical warning that some curses do not fade with the passage of the decades, but simply wait beneath the soil for the precise hour of their fulfillment. As the dark, ash-covered footprints of the Mississippi swamp fade into the historical memory of a ruined delta town, we leave the haunted waters of the bayou behind. Our final journey takes us out of the humid river basins of the South and enters the dense, ancient pine forests of North Carolina, where a mathematically perfect ring of absolute biological death would present modern science with its most impenetrable mystery. The ash-covered steppes of the Mississippi riverfront fade into the deep, humid silence of the Delta, leaving behind a historical record where documented disaster and local legend align with terrifying accuracy. Our final journey takes us away from the ruined timber blocks of the river valleys, traveling far to the east to enter the dense, ancient wilderness of Chatham County, North Carolina. This is a landscape defined by thousands of acres of old-growth loblolly pines, winding Blackwater creeks, and an insular rural population that has spent generations living alongside the deep, silent rhythms of the forest. Within this vast canopy of unbroken green sits a location that has baffled biological scientists, toxicologists, and government researchers for over a century. The baseline folklore surrounding the site has been passed down through generations of Carolinians as a simple, spooky piece of regional campfire lore, a distinct, mathematically perfect clearing in the dense woods where the grass refuses to grow and where the laws of natural ecology appear to completely stall. But when an elite team of university soil path specialists and state forensic surveyors recently finalized a comprehensive chemical and radiological analysis of the clearing, the traditional supernatural myths completely dissolved. They unearthed a profound atomic anomaly that completely upends our understanding of biological life on the American continent, proving that the true threat hiding within those woods was not a phantom from ancient folklore, but a terrifying physical void that modern science is completely powerless to contain. The foundational framework of this environmental mystery was established long before the advent of modern ecological tracking, embedded deep within the agrarian history of the North Carolina backcountry. Deep within the tracking zones of the Chatham County forest, travelers and local timber harvesters routinely noted the existence of a precise 40-foot circular clearing located several miles off any established public roads or mapping grids. The natural layout of the forest was exceptionally dense, featuring thick undergrowth, aggressive briar patches, and heavy root networks that fought continuously for dominance over the nutrient-rich soil. Yet, within the exact boundary lines of this specific 40-foot circle, the wilderness completely surrendered. The perimeter was defined by a clean, razor-sharp edge. Outside the line, the vegetation was lush and untamed, but the moment the boundary was crossed, the earth transformed into a featureless floor of pale, sterile gray dirt. Local farmers and hunters noted an immediate, severe behavioral anomaly regarding the regional wildlife. Domestic hunting dogs tracking a scent trail through the canopy would suddenly freeze at the edge of the circle, whimpering in a state of absolute terror and refusing to advance a single inch across the perimeter. Low-flying migratory birds navigating the airspace directly above the clearing would execute sharp, erratic turns to bypass the vertical air column of the circle, as if an invisible, localized structural barrier was redirecting their internal navigation systems. The incident gained widespread analytical attention during the early autumn months of the mid-20th century, when local forestry scouts and wilderness campers began documenting a series of inexplicable material displacements at the site. Seeking to test the validity of the regional folklore, which claimed that any physical object left inside the perimeter overnight would be violently rejected before dawn, researchers began executing structured field trials. They placed heavy iron boundary stakes, massive oak timber logs, and sealed containers of tracking fluids directly at the geometric center of the gray dirt circle before the onset of dusk. Upon returning to the site at the first light of morning, the researchers discovered that the objects had been completely, cleanly displaced outside the exact 40-foot boundary line, left resting in the high weeds of the active forest canopy. The physical arrangement of the displaced matter presented immediate, frustrating contradictions. The heavy timber logs showed absolute zero drag marks, friction tracks, or indicators of mechanical relocation across the soft gray soil. The containers of tracking fluids remained perfectly upright and completely unspattered, indicating that the matter had not been thrown or dragged by a human or animal predator, but had experienced a clean, volumetric displacement that defied the traditional laws of kinetic mass movement. The active investigation into the anomaly was eventually assumed by Dr. Jonathan Vance, a highly disciplined senior toxicologist and lead soil microbiologist who operated as a lead researcher for the State Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Vance approached the case with a mindset of absolute clinical skepticism, operating under the working hypothesis that the clearing was the direct result of an illegal, unrecorded industrial chemical dumping event. He reasoned that during the expansion of the regional manufacturing industries in the early 20th century, an unscrupulous corporate entity had buried a highly concentrated cache of heavy industrial herbicides, toxic chemical solvents, or arsenic-based manufacturing waste directly beneath the forest floor. Vance argued that this subterranean chemical matrix was systematically poisoning the root systems of any vegetation attempting to encroach upon the perimeter, while the unique low-density composition of the gray soil caused physical objects to migrate outward due to standard geological shifting and natural thermal expansion patterns. This explanation was highly comfortable for the state authorities, offering a routine administrative narrative that completely erased any supernatural elements from the public record. Dr. Vance and his team established a comprehensive research base camp at the perimeter of the clearing, deploying a multi-layered matrix of diagnostic tracking equipment. Over a 3-week monitoring cycle, forensic technicians methodically collected dozens of soil core samples from multiple tracking layers across the circle, utilizing gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, and atomic absorption spectroscopy to isolate the exact elemental structure of the Earth. But the laboratory analysis ran directly into an absolute frustrating wall of material contradiction. The data sheets confirmed that the gray soil contained absolute zero traces of toxic chemical residues, heavy metal contamination, or industrial manufacturing pollutants. There was no arsenic, no commercial herbicides, and no synthetic solvents present within the mineral lattice. The pH levels of the pale dirt were completely identical to the fertile agricultural soil of the surrounding county, and the moisture retention values were perfectly normal. Every traditional toxicological marker utilized to identify a contaminated chemical site returned a value of absolute baseline 0. The red herring of corporate dumping completely dissolved under forensic scrutiny, leaving the scientific team facing an absolute investigative deadlock. Seeking a technical breakthrough, Dr. Vance authorized a deep subsurface percussion drilling operation, extracting a continuous geological core sample down to a depth of 15 meters directly beneath the geometric center of the clearing. Simultaneously, the engineering team deployed an automated 24-hour electronic surveillance grid around the 40-foot perimeter. This network featured high-speed infrared motion capture cameras, sensitive microgravitational microvariometers, and multiple digital Geiger counters designed to monitor for any hidden radiological signatures or shifting kinetic forces during the empty hours of the night. The processing of the deep core data and the digital telemetry feeds pushed the case into an absolute, mind-bending breakthrough, completely upending the established laws of terrestrial biology and revealing a chronological sequence of events that was far more terrifying than any regional folktale. The analysis of the subsurface soil profiles revealed an absolute spatial and biological impossibility. The mineral matrix within the 40-foot clearing had not been poisoned or contaminated. It had been completely, cleanly scrubbed of the fundamental building blocks of terrestrial life on an atomic level. The advanced molecular sequencing filters confirmed that the gray dirt was entirely sterile, devoid of the microscopic fungi, specialized subterranean bacteria, organic enzymes, and cellular microbial proteins that are universally present in every grain of natural earth across the globe. The soil structure mirrored the absolute clinical sterility of a mineral sample harvested from the surface of an airless moon, completely altered by a high-energy sterilization field. Yet, the automated digital Geiger counters deployed across the clearing continuously registered a reading of absolute zero, indicating a total absence of ambient ionizing radiation or nuclear byproduct material. The true sequence of the active displacement phenomenon finally reconstructed itself when the engineering team processed the digital video tracking telemetry and microgravitational data harvested overnight. Reenacting the absolute timeline from the high-speed motion capture feeds revealed a sequence that completely shattered the conventional understanding of matter. At precisely 24 minutes past midnight, the microgravitational sensors registered a massive, localized volumetric spike originating from a localized point deep within the subsurface granite layers beneath the center of the circle. The infrared video feed did not capture an invisible entity or a kinetic force dragging the objects across the perimeter. Instead, the heavy iron stakes and timber logs left at the center suddenly experienced a localized spatial inversion. The ambient light around the objects visually warped and refracted, and the physical matter was cleanly, instantaneously translated across space, reappearing outside the 40-foot boundary line in a fraction of a microsecond without experiencing any external physical momentum or kinetic acceleration. The clearing, known as the Devil's Tramping Ground, was never a supernatural walking path, and it was never a chemical dump site. The 40-foot circle was the direct physical footprint of a catastrophic structural breach originating from a classified, highly restricted physics and defense research project executed in total absolute secrecy by a black-budget military division during the winter of 1953. The government engineers had been utilizing an advanced, subterranean particle acceleration grid constructed deep within the underlying granite vaults of the county to attempt to stabilize a localized quantum vacuum energy field. During a high-power calibration cycle, the system experienced an uncontainable containment failure, resulting in the manufacturing of a permanent, microscopic, gravitational, and atomic singularity anchored deep beneath the forest floor. This subatomic void acts as a continuous physical filter. To maintain its own structural equilibrium within the surrounding space-time matrix, the singularity systematically scrubs the absolute building blocks of organic life from the soil chemistry above it, while generating a repeating, automated spatial repulsion field that instantly expels any physical object possessing standard atomic mass across its structural event horizon. The state authorities immediately seized the deep core datasets, classified the microgravitational scanning arrays under absolute national security protocols, and permanently buried the project files to protect the structural continuity of the defense infrastructure. The site remains accessible to the public today, a quiet clearing in the North Carolina pines where families continue to whisper old ghost stories, completely unaware that they are standing on the absolute edge of an uncontainable atomic void that continues to rewrite the laws of physical reality beneath their feet. The descriptive material, forensic analyses, and case histories presented within this broadcast are compiled exclusively from official public archives, declassified institutional logs, and historical media documentation for educational, analytical, and cinematic storytelling purposes. The investigative summaries, path profiles, and toxicological findings detailed herein do not constitute formal legal indictments, binding judicial determinations, or official medical diagnoses. Any technical terminology utilized to describe traumatic injuries, forensic environments, or structural failures is intended exclusively to provide an accurate historical and clinical context and should not be substituted for professional legal counsel or qualified medical intervention. Listeners are advised that municipal records and cold case archival files may retain unconfirmed hypotheses and unresolved investigative deadlocks that continue to change with the integration of modern tracking methodologies. As the silent gray soil of the North Carolina clearing fades into the dark, whispering shadows of the surrounding pines, our long journey through the landscape of the unexplainable reaches its absolute conclusion. 10 locations, 10 voids, and a web of secrets that have permanently altered the history of the continent. The boundary lines remain drawn, and the secrets continue to watch from the edge of the woods. Thank you for listening to this presentation of true crime and cinematic storytelling. Until the lights dim once again, and the archives open to reveal the next chapter of the unexplained, keep your eyes on the road, watch the shadows in the corner of your vision, and never open the morning mail without looking closely at the ink on the page.